This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
apologies, turn the microphone on. Can I welcome members, officers and the public to today's meeting of the Transport Committee, our first formal meeting of the new Assembly year. The main item for discussion today is accessibility and inclusion in transport planning. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched off or onto silent mode. And can I also ask guests and members to position their microphones so that they can be heard clearly and refrain from talking over each other? I know that will be a big ask. Can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence today.
Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of July 2024?
Agreed.
And can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence received?
Noted.
The committee is recommended to note the response from the Minister for Roads and Local Transport to its letter on the taxi and private hire vehicle industry in London, as attached in Appendix 1. The response from the Mayor of London to its letter on the taxi and private hire industry in London, as attached at Appendix 2. The response from the Mayor of London to its report, Future Road User Charging in London, as attached at Appendix 3. And the response from the Secretary of State for Transport to the consultation on London Travel Watch Board appointments, as attached at Appendix 4. We now move on to our main item of business, which is a question and answer session on accessibility and inclusion in transport planning. The session today will be divided into 2 panels, and I'd like to welcome our guests for this first panel. Firstly, Dr. David Kripe-Kaye, who is Head of Research and Applied Learning at the Mental Health Foundation. And virtually we have Emma Vogelman, Head of Policy, Public Affairs and Campaigns at Transport for All. Welcome, Emma. And Eric Matthews, Policy Officer for the Royal National Institute of Blind People. Welcome, Eric. So I'm going to start off with a general question to the guests, but also we will be asking lots of follow-up questions. It's only 3 of you, and so if I'd ask you to sort of confine your introductory remarks to relatively introductory remarks, and we will have plenty of time for you to go into further issues as we go on. So our first question is, do you think London is an accessible city for disabled people to travel around? David, would you like to start since you're here with us? Thank you.
Yes, of course. It's a very patchy picture. So there are some really, really good bits and there are some really not so good bits. And it will vary in terms of what people need for accessibility and what they've got to do and how much time they've got to do it. So there are some highs and some lows, and I'm sure we'll go into a lot more detail.
We certainly will. Thank you. Emma?
Absolutely. I also want to apologize in advance if there's any background noise. I'm working from home, so I apologize in advance. I would say they're very similar comments to my colleague. London has the capability of being an incredibly accessible city. There are lots of amazing provisions for disabled people to navigate around the city, but as was said, it is patchy and there is a lot of room for improvement.
Thank you, Emma. Eric? I think you may be on mute. I'm not sure if that's us or...
Sorry, can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's no worries.
Hopefully that's the end of the technical difficulties for this. I'd have to agree with what Emma and David have said. Without going into too much detail, I'd like Emma's framing of it as it having the capacity or the potential to be a very accessible city, some of which is realised at this point in time and some of which is not.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Now I'd hand over to Assembly Member Garrett.
Morning. So I suppose we dive into a specific, really. So what do you think, perhaps we'll start with you, David, what do you think are the main barriers to accessibility and what impact do those main barriers have in terms of people's ability to travel around London?
From our research, it definitely varies by group. I think the challenges start with planning a journey. So London is a complicated network, and journeys may often require more than one mode of transport. And I think if it was... So my journey here today, although I came all the way from Zone 9, the very end of the Metropolitan line, and it was a breeze, that's because I only had to change once. And even that, I did quite a lot of planning for. Certainly if you have to coordinate buses, trains, or tubes with anything else, you have to change. That makes it much more complicated. So I would say the challenges with transport start with planning, understanding where you've got to, and having the confidence that you will be able to get there in the time that's outlined. Then, and that's before you start. Once you've started, it really varies by group and by mechanism. So our research focused on the mental health impact for 3 particular groups: people with existing mental health problems, people living with dementia, and parents with young children. And there were some common themes and there were some different themes. But the planning was a common theme. Signage and directions once you're on the network can be quite complicated. Access to platforms or onto buses was a particular problem for all groups. And then once you're on your first bit of transport, actually having the space to do your first bit of journey in a safe feeling session definitely felt problematic. So that business of sharing your space with other people, particularly if you have either mobility issues or you have sensory issues, or you have you have children or caring responsibilities, then you are often trying to compete for space just to actually be on the item of transport. Then getting off, and if you have to change, working out how you get from where you are to where you need to be next, even if you're in the same station or in the same kind of interchange area, that can be complicated. And just so often things don't link up. So even for me, I live 2 miles away from the Metropolitan line station. We have 2 trains an hour into London. Our buses don't match with that. So I almost always have to spend 20 minutes. If I want to go by bus to the station, I almost always have to spend 20 minutes because they don't link up. And I think the other thing is that people were particularly concerned about health and social care appointments, which is a big priority for them, and the people providing those appointments not being conscious of just how long and complicated the travel is, and actually a little bit of consideration around either flexibility in those appointments. That would have been one of the things that would hugely have reduced the anxiety people exposed. I have to say, underpinning all this, getting out and connecting, and the transport that allows people to do that is really good for people's mental health when it works. So, getting it right is a huge win. But there's quite a lot of steps that need to be done to make it feel safe, secure, and to make it a kind of uniformly mentally healthy activity rather than one that's kind of always seesawing on a balance between, good for your mental health and bad for your mental health.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, this morning I woke up with a plan to come here that involved 2 stages, and then my train was cancelled, so I had 4 stages. And I can very well imagine, having someone who struggles with change, struggles with uncertainty, or just perhaps has dementia, is going to find that much harder than I found it. And particularly when you've got a deadline at the end that you're worried about. Yeah, I can see that's a big challenge. Thank you very much, David. Emma, what, from your point of view, are the biggest obstacles, and what impact does that have on getting around?
Absolutely. So I think I first want to start with a piece of research that we published at the end of 2023. We asked all disabled people, but we had the majority of our respondents who are London-based answered the question, do they think that transport will improve, stay the same, or get worse over the next 10 years? And we found that 45% of disabled Londoners believe that the accessibility of transport and streets will get worse in the next 10 years. 23% believe that it will stay the same, and only 32% of people that we surveyed felt that things would improve. And I think that sends a really strong message about the amount of barriers that disabled people are already experiencing across all modes of transport. So at Transport for All, we look at all modes, everything from walking and wheeling, so that's looking at quality of pavements, just as an example, all the way through to bus, light rail, heavy rail, and taxis, private hire vehicles, and private car use. There are a huge number of barriers for all of those. I would absolutely agree with the point around planning. We found that 60% of London respondents have to always plan their journey in advance, and exactly what you were saying. When you can plan things in advance, but when things go wrong for whatever reason, it's even more difficult for disabled people to try and make decisions, but also try and get whatever assistance provision that they need in place for those disrupted journeys. And I think we are all potentially thinking about Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson, who only last week was traveling into King's Cross Station, and the assistance was not there to meet her. So that, I say, is one of the significant barriers for disabled people traveling around London. I think primarily, though, what needs to happen is disabled people need to be more involved in decision making. So right now in the CFL network, for example, we are hearing every single day from disabled people that various lifts are out of service at the moment, whether that's for planned works or unplanned repairs, and that's really having a negative impact on people's ability to travel. And that's bearing in mind that so much of the underground network is not accessible to a wide range of disabled people. We're not just looking at step-free access, but we're also looking at provision of staff. We're looking at step-free. We're looking at a number of criteria that can make a station accessible or not to a disabled person. We also hear on the bus network a lot from disabled people that discrimination and sort of poor attitudes from both drivers and other passengers is a really big concern, and we would like to see that addressed in lots of different ways, primarily through training, but that training needs to be done with disabled people. So I would say that there are sort of the top line barriers, but overall it's when policy and infrastructure is put in without disabled people's involvement, it's when you see the failures start to happen.
Thanks very much. And it, not to harp on about my journey, but it involved visiting or changing at two stations I didn't think I'd even visit this morning. And for me, it was not a concern whether there was step-free access, but obviously for some travellers, if that had landed them at a non-step-free transition, that would have been a huge problem. That's a very good point. Thank you. And Eric, what do you think are the main barriers, and what impact do they have?
I'd like to agree with what David said about how it starts with planning a journey, particularly when so many options to do that are online these days, which isn't accessible to all blind and partially sighted people, particularly considering that twice as many blind and partially sighted people are what we call digitally excluded compared to the sighted population, and that just means not using or having access to the internet in the last 3 months. A lot of people, so not just that, but I think there's a higher priority put on planning as well, particularly for unfamiliar journeys. What we find, and what I can absolutely vouch for as someone registered blind myself, is that an unfamiliar journey is a much more complicated and difficult thing to consider than a familiar journey. And that means any kind of disruption to a journey, exactly like you were saying about this morning, would have been much more tiring, much more stressful for me to deal with. If I had been attending in person and had to deal with that kind of thing, it makes a real difference on how well I can do my job in that situation because of the impact that travel has already had on me just to get there. And again, I then moved to the streets because you can't get anywhere without walking or wheeling, really, even if you are, eventually going to other modes of transport. And we have done some work with Will Norman and Seb Dance. We had a guided walk with them recently to kind of give them the experience of moving around central London with what we call simulation specs, which kind of simulate various common eye conditions to give them a sense of what it's like, how it changes how you think about things, how you react, how you interact with your environment, if you have one of these kinds of conditions. And from that we found that they really appreciated the value of things like curbs, which are being taken away sometimes to make shared space or shared use areas where cyclists are meant to share the area with pedestrians, which we all find very stressful, and I think they appreciate too. Things like bus stops, the ones that are incorporating cycle lanes, are done in such a way that it's almost impossible for a blind or partially sighted person to know when there is a cycle there. And if that means you can't get to the bus stop or you can't get to the bus, that means your journey's done, basically, at that point. You can't do whatever it was you were going to do after you get off the bus as well. I'd also like to agree with what David said about signage and instructions. Obviously, again, a lot of times those are inaccessible either because the sign isn't, done in with clear print, in good contrast, in a big enough font, but also, again, the increasing amounts of digital information are not always done with accessibility to blind and partially sighted people in mind. And I'd like to touch quickly on both staff. Again, the inconsistency, not knowing what to expect in terms of their sight loss awareness. So if, for instance, you are trying to use the Underground, what I find is that I've had some really brilliant experiences with really helpful staff who explain things clearly, who make sure I'm known to the staff at the station I'm traveling to, who make sure the driver of the train knows that I'm there right in the car right behind them, all that sort of thing. And then sometimes no one turns up at all. So there's no way you can tell for sure what kind of experience you're going to have. So again, when you're planning the journey, one of the things you're thinking about is, what if that happens? What if I have that bad thing? What if everything goes wrong? Because sometimes it does. So even when something goes well, I feel like there's still a heightened level of tiredness and stress that can come along with that, just because you couldn't guarantee in advance that was going to happen. And I also want to echo what Emma said about public attitudes. There's thinking that it's not widely understood why a blind or partially sighted person might need a priority seat, for example. If we can walk, the thinking is we should be fine. There's also a lot of blind and partially sighted people report hostility to them for not looking blind enough, if I can put that in air quotes. There's a stereotype of how a blind person looks and interacts with the world, and very few blind or partially sighted people actually even have a white cane or a guide dog, never mind sort of some of the more negative stereotypes that can go along with that. So I think there's a real lack of understanding among the public too of what disability looks like when they encounter it on public transport or on the streets.
Thank you all three. That's very. There's a couple of themes there, I suppose. One is the additional challenge of planning, and then secondly is the additional challenge of disruption, which is a sadly familiar reality of public transport. So, having sort of gone through the problems, thinking about the positives. So, what areas, where do you think TfL is making good progress on overcoming problems, and what do you think should be the priority? And I suppose an additional thought from me are the biggest barriers to overcoming those barriers, if you like, the biggest what's holding that back? Is it about lack of money in your view? Is it about lack of will or awareness? Or is it where there are trade-offs? We're coming on later on to talk about street space, but in some cases there are obviously trade-offs between different kinds of groups of people that are trying to use the same space. So if we want to start with you, David, what's working well and what should be the priority?
I think what's working well and what could certainly be built on is, and it's been touched on by all of us, is transport staff attitudes and behaviour. You get someone who is good and supportive, or even just smiles and says hello and is conscious, that is a really good starting point. If that could be built on with really good training so that is more common, even just so I don't know how many other people, I wear a sunflower lanyard because of my hearing. I would say more than half of staff on the transport network don't know what that means on the basis of my experiences. And as soon as you explain it, it's really, really helpful and good. And when you get good passenger assistance, that's fantastic. So there is assistance and support there, and that is definitely something we could build on. Most disabilities are not visible, and I would absolutely reinforce those kind of caricatures of blindness. People who, with mental health problems, have no visible, often have no visible signs of disability. People like me with hearing loss have no visible signs, and so on. So we need people to be aware of us in other ways. And I choose this, and I find this very helpful. We found in our research 54% of people weren't aware of this. And we also found that a lot of people didn't want to wear this because it marked them out as different, or exposed them to some of those kind of attitudes that are unhelpful. So when support is done well, that makes a huge difference. People who help you plan, so having people around, staff around visibly, is really good and helpful. And that's something I think when you go to places that you do have is great, and when you don't is not great. Buses are a real problem area with that, because when I was growing up, you used to have two members of staff on a bus as standard. You'd have a conductor, you'd have a driver, and that just meant there was more help. On the downside, they really weren't very accessible at all, because they had spiral staircases and open ends. But, you know, so big plus on the accessible bit, providing people aren't parking so that the bus can get to the curb, providing the driver remembers to let the bus down, because a lot of them have that ability, provided, as colleagues said, you know, there aren't cyclists whizzing between you and the bus, and so on. So there's some really good technical stuff. Bearing in mind the issue about digital exclusion, certainly we found a lot of people find transport apps very, very helpful. I use one pretty much all the time. I know a lot of people do, and that people do find very helpful and accessible. And, you know, if I ask staff, you know, where there are disruptions, if I say to staff, I can't always hear the announcements, can you just tell me? 9 times out of 10 they do, providing I can find someone and providing they can find me. So, you know, staff are brilliant when they're there, when they're trained, and when they're understanding. And the technology is great when it's accessible and useful.
Great. Thanks very much, David. Emma, what's working well? What should be the priority?
Absolutely. I think that there are a couple of things that I want to point out that are going particularly well. I think the first is maintaining the ban on pavement parking. This is something that Transport for All would like to see across the UK, but pavement parking is a huge barrier for disabled people when walking and wheeling. So I think that the continued ban on that is a real bonus. Going on from David's point around the accessible infrastructure, I think we have to mention black cabs, because all London black cabs do have a built-in ramp, and even on the newer electric vehicle black cabs that we have, those ramps are actually improved in design that make it a lot easier for wheelchair users and other disabled people to access black cabs. And I think disabled people tend to be more reliant on private transport because of the inaccessibility of public transport. So I think we have to mention that black cabs are an incredible asset to London. What I think is missing in terms of black cabs is driver awareness and driver training when it comes to supporting disabled people. But I would also say that we hear so often, and I'm sure Eric will be touching on this, but the amount of refusals that disabled people experience from taxi drivers in terms of not providing them with the assistance that they need to, say, get the ramp out, or people with assistance dogs who are being refused journeys in a black cab. I myself, I'm an electric wheelchair user, and I travel with a PA. I have to pretend that I'm not with my PA when they are flagging down a taxi, because I know that if I appeared to be with them, a driver is much, much less likely to pull over and take me as a passenger than they would for my visibly non-disabled PA. So that is something that I think needs immediate attention, is driver training and driver awareness of the needs of disabled passengers and the impact of their decisions. I think as well, when it comes to refusals to take disabled passengers, something that is desperately needed is a campaign for disabled people to know that they can report those instances of poor treatment from taxi drivers, whether or not they have all of the necessary information. It's still helpful for disabled people to report how often this is happening, so that TfL has a good picture of how severe the issue is. I think the other thing that is going well in terms of TfL is the transparency around funding for step-free stations. There is a model that's used to show the public how investment decisions are made in terms of making the next stations step-free. And it looks at things like TfL investment from the local business community, things like that. And although it's frustrating for disabled people to see such slow progress being made to make the network more accessible, at least we can now understand how decisions are made, and that looking at where is the next accessible station positioned, how do we use that in that prioritization model is incredibly helpful. So I think that those are the three things that are going particularly well, but definitely room for improvement in terms of taxi drivers and noting the amount of times that disabled people get refused as passengers, and then also the speed of which the network is being made more accessible, not just in terms of step-free, but where are toilets going in, where are things like overcrowding being mitigated, and things like that. So I would say that those are the areas that are going well, but in all of those cases, you need disabled people to be part of the solutions. The only way that drivers of buses, of a taxi, of a train are going to know the needs of disabled passengers and therefore adapt their behavior to make their experience better is by engaging with disabled passengers and finding out exactly how decisions that they make impact disabled people's journeys. And we've talked a little bit about staff, and I would completely agree that staff training in terms of providing assistance on trains and on buses is incredibly needed, but disabled people need to be part of that training process.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's heartbreaking to hear the point about almost having to. I visited a special needs school in my constituency, and these were primary school age children who had already learnt the art of ambushing a driver of a bus by getting their able-bodied friend to stand at the bus stop and for them to hide behind the bus stop until after the bus had already stopped, precisely for the problem that you described, where they just think, well, they might not stop because we're just too much trouble. These were primary school age kids. It was quite upsetting actually to hear what they've been taught by our transport network.
And it's completely unacceptable that does happen. There are legal protections in place, particularly in the Equality Act, to address the point around driver refusals. But the way that that's communicated to taxi drivers, I think, could be a lot better. And I also wanted to highlight the amount of times that disabled people, particularly who use assistance dogs, are told that the driver is allergic or has some sort of medical condition that means they aren't able to take an assistance dog. We know that only one taxi driver in London has been given that type of exemption. They have proven that they are unable to have a dog in their cab due to allergies or whatever it might be. But the rate in which we hear this happening, it can't be that one driver who just happens to be interacting
around
with
a lot,
all
apparently.
of these.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it just quickly on the step-free access. I know that is something that TfL would say. So TfL would say that the training issues you've highlighted are a priority as well. In terms of the spending, I mean, I think that's an illustration of the frustration of, say, when the mayor spends 24 million on a sort of 3-month trial of off-peak. You look at that and you think that could have been spent on several more stations being step-free, which would make it easier to plan journeys and easier to deal with disrupted journeys, you would think. It's a shame that that wasn't his priority. Finally then, sorry, Eric, so in terms of what's going well and what the priority should be.
Thanks. I would say from our point of view, audiovisual announcements on buses is going well. This is a thing that most of the rest of the country is still lacking. And that, for example, a colleague of mine who splits their time between Norwich and London says it's a total night and day difference in terms of the buses just being much more accessible, because you're never going to get that lost. You're never going to be that, stressed or unsure about where you are. This is something we're very glad of and hoping to press for in other parts of the country. And similarly, maintaining the ban on pavement parking, like Emma said, is so valuable. We're seeing that implemented kind of less consistently in Scotland at the moment, and it really is a credit to London that there's more expectation that this is just not going to happen. For something that could be improved upon, I think it would be really beneficial to have better control over parking of e-bikes and e-scooters on pavements as well. We are hearing so much these days about e-bikes particularly being a real hazard for blind and partially sighted people traveling around London, because of there's the frequency with which they're just kind of left wherever the person riding the bike stopped needing it, in the middle of the pavement, left piled on top of other bikes, whatever. Leads to such a high risk of collision with those, tripping over those, and because they're so heavy and they're so big, because of the batteries, it can cause some really, more not just unpleasant injuries, but really debilitating ones. I'd echo what the other said about staff awareness. Again, I think what should happen there is just more consistency. Like Emma said, there are people who really get it, who absolutely, know what to do and are happy to do it. But I think, again, just getting that more consistently available across the staff that disabled people are going to encounter on a journey. And I always also echo what Emma said about the necessity for disabled people to be involved in the design and delivery of that training, which is in the government's own inclusive travel strategy. And another thing I like about the inclusive travel strategy is it says that training should be delivered not just to frontline staff, but to managers as well. I think if it's going to be consistent, it has to be a culture change, not just something for the bus drivers or whoever kind of at the bottom of the org chart to worry about, but something that's everyone's aware of and everyone's responsible for. And then just quickly, I'd also like to agree with what Emma said about a campaign for disabled people to know they can report instances of poor treatment from staff or other negative experiences that they have. Again, even if it's just in terms of TfL's own monitoring. We know that the ORR has done an interesting report recently about complaints, obviously, particularly about trains, and that's its own complicated situation, which shows that a lot of time people don't complain either because they don't know how to, they don't think anything will be done about it, or the process isn't accessible to them. And I think all of that leads to us not really understanding the scope of some of these problems as well as any of us would like to. And that's definitely something that could be fixed with more accessible and more transparent complaints processes.
Understood. Thank you. The pavement parking point's well made. I think it was banned in London in the 70s, so hopefully any minute now the rest of the country will catch up. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Assemblymember Garrett. Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair. So, and thank you, first of all, to the panellists for your examples of the stories that you and people across London have had to face in terms of day-to-day journeys and some of the challenges that you've talked about, the lack of consistency, the intolerance and prejudice and discrimination, but also some really positive stuff that you've come up with in terms of the support that you've received from frontline members of staff, which has been really warming to hear. I'm going to focus primarily on step-free access, and Emma, I wanted to start with yourself. We know that Transport for All has said that issues with step-free access or level boarding on the rail network is a barrier for 43% of disabled people, and leads to disabled people having often longer, more complicated routes with higher fares. And you talked about some of the challenges even with some of those when you try and take a taxi as an alternative. So two-part question on this to start off with is, do you think the measures set out in the Equality in Motion are sufficient to support disabled passengers in London who require step-free access? And secondly, what else would you like to see happening?
Absolutely. So I think it's really important to distinguish between step-free access and level boarding. I think in terms of level boarding, we have been frustrated by the way that new stations or new services have not been designed with level boarding in mind, because this would allow disabled passengers, particularly those with wheeled mobility aids, to travel a lot more independently, which would take away the worry and the anxiety over trying to find a member of staff to provide that assistance. So I think it's an incredibly important point. I think in terms of equity in motion, so Transport for All has had a number of conversations with TfL about equity in motion, and we're hopeful that some of the new ways they plan to interact with disabled people will result in maybe speedier decisions to make stations step-free, or to implement level boarding where possible. I do think that there is room for improvement and there's room for more ambition within Equity in Motion to consult with disabled people and really understand where are the priority stations for disabled people, because we have to look at, you mentioned about having to maybe divert a journey or go on a different route, and largely that's because your ideal destination station doesn't have the facilities that you need, whether that's level boarding or it's step free, or that you're going to be able to find a staff member fairly easily to get that support. And when sections of the network are maintained inaccessible, it sort of cuts out huge sections of London that disabled people are able to access. So we need to be looking at, okay, where is the next closest step-free station? And how might that impact a disabled person's journey to get to this area? So I think that there is definitely room for growth. At the moment, we're not sort of seeing the engagement that we would like to. Equity in Motion does have plans to create panels of disabled passengers where they will be able to sort of test ideas with, etc. And it's something that we have pressed them on to find out exactly how is that going to happen. How are you going to make sure that you're getting a wide range of disabled people as well, to make sure that you're addressing the needs across the incredibly diverse community that the disabled community is. So I think that there is certainly room for more ambition within Equity in Motion.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. So just going to one of the points that you raised there about the quality of step-free access works, and again, another report that you produced said outside of central London and Heathrow, Crossrail will only be step-free from street to platform, i.e. level access at those stations. That's a massively missed opportunity, which could have seen this key route grant disabled people the ability to travel freely and with independence. You won't need me to highlight the issues within my own constituency of Ealing Broadway, which have come to the forefront, a station I use pretty much daily and used today. We've made a number of improvements in the last few weeks to try and encourage people to board more safely and provide that additional support to ensure that people can do so. But actually, going back to the design point that you raised as well as part of your answer, what could we do to ensure that the quality of the step-free station work that we deliver as part of the feasibility can be improved going forward?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important question. I think so. I'll give an example of investment that I think was, I don't want to say misjudged, but something that we raised an issue with. So TfL informed us and others that the Piccadilly line, some of the new stock that will service that line, will be made much more accessible to disabled people. I believe it's going to be sort of bigger. There are going to be more priority spacing and seating for wheelchair users and those with other impairments. It's going to have audio-visual announcements, etc., all of which sounds really great. However, what wasn't picked up until, in my opinion, it's too late, the gap between the platform edge and the new stock is actually wider than at some existing stations. So that means that for many people, myself included, who use an electric wheelchair, that brand new stock is already inaccessible to me because I can't get over that larger gap, and particularly not without assistance. So I raised this with TfL and sort of asked, okay, well, how were disabled people brought into that conversation? Why wasn't this picked up sooner? And the independent disability advisory group that TfL regularly use, I think, are fantastic. And I know that they're going through a recruitment drive at the moment. However, when those plans for the Piccadilly line trains were being brought into creation, there were only 8 disabled people that were consulted on any potential design problems or ways to make that new stock more accessible and usable to disabled people. And it wasn't picked up, the larger gap. It was thought that it wouldn't be too much of an issue, but when in actuality it is. So I think that that's an example of where investment didn't match up with disabled people's expectations, because if you had consulted with more disabled people, that would have been caught much sooner, and therefore that money could have been spent much more wisely in terms of the design of the new stock for the Piccadilly line. So it's something that we are concerned about when the investment goes in to make either the train carriages or a station to have improvements, that disabled people aren't brought in early enough to make sure that it's future proof for them and for other disabled people.
That's really helpful, Emma, and we're going to come back to that particular topic, so I'm not going to delve further into that particular point. But in terms of you also mentioned in terms of one of your answers around pace, and certainly another example locally where I've seen stop-start projects. So under the previous mayor, Greenford Station had seen money invested for step-free access, but then it was just gone by the wayside and nothing had actually improved. And then we finally pushed again as local authority delivered level access at Greenford Station at a fraction of the price that TfL had originally quoted, so 2.2 million instead of 10 million pounds there. What else do you feel that we could be doing to deliver step-free access at a faster pace that we're not doing now?
So in terms of how to find the investment for those larger scale projects, I feel is possibly outside of my remit or my expertise, but what I can say is that where there is currently not step-free access, or where there is temporarily no step-free access. So like I think I mentioned, a lot of lifts at the moment at major interchange stations are being repaired or upgraded, whatever the terms are. And the problem that we're seeing is that lots of these station lift improvements are happening at the same time. So where there isn't a sort of foresight in how are disabled people going to use the network with these major stations all out at one time, it makes large sections of the network inaccessible. So I think in the interim, while step-free access and the investment to do that is being looked at, you need to be providing that those alternative modes of transport for disabled people. So where a disabled person might go to a station and realize that they're unable to use it, there is an expectation that TfL would then find them a taxi and they would cover the cost of that to take them either to their destination or to the next most accessible station. And that's not being done as consistently as we would like. It's also not being promoted to disabled passengers as something that they have an entitlement to and something that they can ask for at stations. So it's something that we certainly raise, that where step-free access isn't already possible or it's temporarily out of action, provisions need to be in place so that disabled people don't have to maybe turn down a job interview or don't get to go to a consultant appointment because of poorly thought through improvements.
Thanks again, Emma. And conscious of time, I'm just going to ask very, very quickly, final question in terms of, we talked about step-free access as being a key point about accessibility, but we've also had conversations around access to public toilets at stations as well. So where do you feel that is in terms of importance from TfL's point of view, and where we need to go going forward on it as well?
Absolutely. So it's something that I did want to highlight. So somewhat recently, Transport for All worked with a number of other organizations to look at the public transport accessibility levels, also known as PTALs, to look at how decisions are currently being made, looking at how connected areas of London are in terms of transport links, and how connected they are to other areas, and making decisions to put in investment in those areas that are better connected than others. And one factor that we looked at in terms of how do PTALs at the moment capture the disabled person's experience of an area. And one thing that people did bring up to us was that if there isn't a public toilet, let alone an accessible or changing places toilet available, then that section of the network is not accessible to them. So I think that we absolutely need to be pushing for greater toilet provision. It's something that we are very keen to see happen. It's something that we're actually going to be proposing a sort of an alternate PTAL measure. We have a report coming out later this year, which invites will be circulated to everyone on this committee to come and hear about that research. But one of the factors that we wanted to be built in to those measures that decide investment is the provision of toilets, because it makes so much of the network inaccessible to disabled people if it isn't there.
Yeah, just to underline the point about toilets, it's really difficult to actually plan a journey to include toilet breaks. I don't know if there's information that tells you which stations do and don't have accessible toilets. I've tried to find it. I've got my own very detailed notes that I share. I'm happy to share with anyone. I'm delighted that Farringdon still has an accessible toilet, and it was accessible this morning. Finchley Road is a nightmare because you just don't know when it's going to be open or not. Wembley Park's very good. I could go on. Baker Street's marginal. But that is something that is hugely anxiety-provoking for some folk. Came up with some of our dementia colleagues, and it definitely, I would underline that it definitely makes some parts of the network inaccessible.
Thank you. And Emma, I'm sure we would be very, very interested in that report and that research when it comes out.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to all three guests. I was going to give Emma a shout out for having mentioned toilets earlier on, and I think David's explanation just then of the anxiety that kind of is attached to not knowing where toilets are. That's something that the Health Committee in our report on toilets about 4 years ago now heard very loud and clear from so many Londoners, and we're all though just waiting for Transport for London's feasibility study to be published. It was going to be published at the beginning of 2024, and I have had an update from TfL. They are working on it, but they still haven't actually said anything. So we need to make sure we get them to actually tell us what they're working on and how they are taking on board the idea of toilets being part of the step-free landscape of our train stations. But I just wanted to pick up, sort of in terms of step-free, one of the things that has come up this morning was the point about help from staff making journeys. And there's a pan-TfL review of the effectiveness of the travel assistance that is provided for customers who have additional access requirements, and that includes disabled people, but also parents and people travelling with small children, and also obviously older Londoners or Londoners with conditions like dementia. And I just wonder if any of you have, particularly we've heard, the very vivid descriptions by Tanni Gray-Thompson of her experiences literally having to crawl off a train the other day because there was no assistance. And I just wonder if if each of you would like to comment on this pan-TfL review of the effectiveness of travel assistance, and do you think it's actually going to be effective in answering some of these questions?
Yeah, I'm not hugely familiar with the review. I mean, certainly the topic of passenger assistance was one of the most important ones, particularly the difference between people who knew about it and used it and those that didn't was enormous. I mean, the people who used it, the vast majority found it useful and helpful. But so many people either didn't know about it or didn't want to use it.
I'm really sorry because I realise I've stepped into a question that's coming up later. Oh, have I? No. No, I thought there was... No? Okay, good. Keep going.
I mean, again, hopefully this is a helpful answer. For us, across all our research groups, making people more aware of passenger assistance, making sure that all staff are aware of where the assistance is available and pointing people to it, or better still, pointing the assistance at the people who need it. And then more work about making sure that other passengers are aware of particularly invisible disabilities and the assistance things available. And even I remember talking to a member of staff at Baker Street about it. And she was super helpful once I'd explained what this was. And she said, I'm going to get one for my mum. So, those things are great, but the awareness is very low and the expectations are very low. And some people still find it stigmatising to even ask for help. So there's some work around that. I think that's probably all I'm comfortable with.
That's really helpful, and I think that lack of awareness, that need for training, is coming through loud and clear this morning as well.
Sorry, just one thing to add that passenger assistance could do better. I did, as part of dissemination for our research, we took over King's Cross Station for a day, which was amazing. And I explicitly asked passenger assistance, the Sunplough scheme, if they wanted to be interested in coming along and talking about that at our stand. We didn't hear back from them. So they're actually quite difficult to contact to do anything other than apply for a thing. To actually get them to come and talk to us as the Mental Health Foundation just proved impossible, and that was a bit weird.
So need for more engagement.
Yeah. So they could do a little bit more to get out to organisations like us. I don't know, maybe my colleagues have had more success with that, but that was surprising because we wanted to be helpful and help raise their profile, and we just didn't hear back from them, which was a bit weird.
Okay, yes, I mean, it'll be, we don't know what the background was on that particular thing, but certainly that point about the need for more engagement is coming through loud and clear. Emma, did you want to add anything on the kind of the passenger assistance piece and whether you've come across this pan-TfL review of the effectiveness of it?
Absolutely, I'd love to. So I think in terms of apologies if you can hear that buzzing in the background, I do apologize. So I think in terms of passenger assist, we at Transport for All are very familiar with the service, but I think it's important to note that in a recent report that was published by the Office of Rail and Road is that the passenger assistance booking provision is only successful 75% of the time. So it's not a guarantee that if you book assistance that it will be there and you will be able to make your journey smoothly and as planned. But I think even more important than that is not forgetting that disabled people should be able to turn up at any station and travel. Turn up and go cannot be underemphasized. It cannot be overemphasized because I know we've talked about a few of your journeys into this session this morning, but I was interviewed last week by the media as part of the coverage, as you said, around what happened to Baroness Thompson. And I was asked, what do disabled people have to do before they make a journey? And I said, well, we shouldn't have to do anything. You know, other passengers don't have to make provisions for traveling other than purchasing a ticket. So why is it disabled people are expected to make all of these bookings and arrangements in so much advance and then to find that even that doesn't always work? I think I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of that TfL review, but what I can tell you is that we hear from disabled people all the time that they struggle to find a member of staff at stations when they need assistance. And for those with, say, an energy limiting impairment or a mobility restricting impairment, it's not possible to trek up and down every platform to try and find someone to provide that assistance. So staff can make the world of difference to a disabled person's travel experience, but finding them is difficult. Getting someone who has an attitude that doesn't make the disabled person feel like a burden or a problem is also incredibly important. And I won't go on because I think, like you said, the point around training has been made, and staff training in regards to providing that assistance is absolutely needed, and improvement is needed there to make staff aware of the impact that they have on a disabled person's day when they just get on with providing the assistance. They don't make the disabled person feel like they're taking them away from something much more important that it should be doing, because providing that assistance is part of their job, and disabled people deserve the right to travel same as everyone else.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. Just to be clear, I'm wondering, because this Equity in Motion says that this pan-TfL review of the effectiveness of travel assistance is going to happen in 2024. I'm wondering if maybe they haven't yet launched it. If they haven't, we'll be able to feed back what you've said from the Transport Committee. But Eric, did you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, so I recently did a consultation about about rail travel, but I think it applies to all kinds of staff assistants. The things people were saying echo what Emma was saying about people feeling like a burden, feeling like they were putting staff out by requesting assistance, which can also be fed by some of the staff's ideas, like being surprised that a blind or partially sighted person would be traveling alone, saying things like, if I was blind, I would never travel alone, and just kind of, clearly letting their own misconceptions maybe get in the way of doing their job effectively. The fact that a negative experience, again, isn't inevitable. We've heard, staff assistance is one of those things that when it works well is brilliant. But it's when it doesn't that people end up with, anecdotes they tell for years. So there's, and like Emma said, there's no, the expectation of assistance arriving and of being effective and of being, appropriate, isn't always met with the reality. So it's always people report that this is kind of, they always have to plan for the fact that the assistance might not work. And again, that affects what stations people travel to, when they travel, if they travel. So it has a really big effect. But I think the other points that I would make have been covered.
Thank you. That's incredibly clear and very powerful testimony from all three of you just about the need for really good quality, well-trained assistance. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Assembly Member Russell, and thank you to the guests for all the information you've given us so far. It's really, really important. Would just like to say to Assembly members that we're running behind a little bit, so just be aware of that. But everything you're telling us is very important, guests. It's nothing towards you. And Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to just go back to some previous comments that were made about particularly on the Elizabeth line and Ealing Broadway and also Hanwell Station. I actually wrote to the Mayor recently about the issues to do with the gaps and the platforms there. So I'd like to talk to Eric specifically on this because, Eric, some of the things that were put in place and the response that I was given by Seb Dance, the Deputy Mayor, I thought was quite interesting. And from your perspective and from a blind passenger's perspective, I'd like to know what kind of consultation you had on these particular changes. So, for example, some of the things that they have done now in regards to the gaps and the issues of Ealing Broadway was to have signage with Mind the Gap floor markings, so staff, new posters and frosted glass where the windows overlook the platforms to discourage passengers rushing when they board incoming trains. Do you think that that's sufficient enough for particularly blind passengers, and what could be done to improve the issues involving step-free access, particularly there?
I mean, I've got to say, all those sound like visual, if I've remembered right. You've got signs, you've got Mind the Gap on the ground, and you've got frosted glass. That's a new one on me. So obviously, I don't think, I mean, the frosted glass would just confuse me for one thing. And I think that there's no expectation that, I'm not going to rush on anyway, but I think, I don't think any of that sounds sufficient to help blind and partially sighted people. And I'm really glad you've asked about this because, well, it was very appropriate to speak to Emma, who did a brilliant job describing disabled people's concerns about the platform train interface, particularly. That's a massive issue for blind and partially sighted people as well. It's one of the places where we're much more likely to be injured than sighted people in attempts to get off, and particularly on trains. So I think that, especially if it's crowded, there's a real concern because I find it complicated. To try and arrange my thoughts a bit better, I'm just so baffled by the frosted glass.
Yeah, I thought you might be. That's why I mentioned it, because I thought, gosh, how is that going to help? And particularly passengers who are blind or have visual issues, that I just can't see how that's helpful. But it's interesting, and I'm very happy to share the letter with you. And I'd love to see whether you could perhaps explore further how we could improve the situation there, particularly for blind passengers, as you say, are very likely to be impacted by the gaps there at that station and others.
That would be great. Yeah, please do get in touch. Thank you.
I'd also like to just go back to Emma's points as well. You did mention lifts earlier as well. And how useful has the TfL app been in alerting passengers about lift accessibility. There's always been, in my experience, an issue, and it's been raised with me by other disability groups, that when a lift breaks down, it's not always notified, but in terms of the apps, and you consider the time and effort you put into planning a journey, and then you turn up and the lift isn't working. What kind of issues have you been finding, and how can we improve that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned it, because this is happening a lot at the moment, particularly. We hear quite regularly over the summer from disabled people that they will have checked their journey. They'll have even checked it, right when they're leaving their home to get to a station, to double check that lift is working. They get there and it's not working. So I would say that the provision of that lifetime information could not be more important, because it's a complete waste of a disabled person's time to show up at a station that they can not use at all. So I think that absolutely needs to be improved. But I think what also needs to be improved is, when that happens, staff at that station need to know what to be telling that passenger who's turned up and asked why, is the lift not working? They get confirmed, no, it's not, for whatever reason. Often staff don't know a time frame for when the lift will be back in service, but they're also not providing that assistance in terms of, can we get you a taxi to your destination, or can we get you a taxi to the next available accessible station, which then that burden falls on the disabled person to replan their journey to find out what that station is. They may not have done the amount of research into that station's intelligence that they would like to, and they turn up and it could be completely unsuitable for that. So it's incredibly important that live information is available, but also that staff know what to do in those instances and provide alternatives to disabled people, so they don't have to replan on the fly by themselves in just outside of an incredibly busy station.
Thank you. I know it's been a massive issue. It's in some ways I've heard people just not bothering, just going home, because what's the point? Because it's going to add so much time to the journey. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thank you. Just very, very quickly, because I think whether Assemblymember Bukhari was just listing the visual signages at the station for brevity, but actually a number of other changes have happened at Ealing Broadway as short-term measures to improve the situation, which should have been in the letter that she had received from the Deputy Mayor. But considerable additional staffing has been put in at Ealing Broadway Station 2, particularly at that point where the gap is biggest and also closest to the stairs and the lift, but also very frequent audio announcements are made in terms of minding the gap at that location as well. So I know that both the staff and TfL are making every effort to deal with that situation in the short term, but I think one of the key things will be about making sure that we can resolve that situation in the medium to long term as well.
Okay. Assemblymember McCartney.
Yes, thank you. I want to ask about priority seating, and if I can start with Eric, because you mentioned this a little earlier, but certainly it's something that you have been raising with Transport for London for a number of years now. I know they have made some changes, so they have now distinctive priority seat designs, and they're rolling out priority seat maquettes in buses. But I really wanted to ask you that TfL have said they're going to use their Disabled Londoners panel to conduct a deep dive into priority seating this year. Can you just explain what is the importance of priority seating for accessibility, and what outcome do you want to see from this deep dive, and indeed, are you involved in it at all? So Eric, can I start with you?
Yeah, I haven't personally been involved with it, but we do have on my team a regional campaigns officer specific to London who does do a lot of the TFL stuff. So I'm happy to take that away and consult with her and find out if we are involved with that, because I suspect if we are, it's her that will be. The importance of priority seating for blind and partially sighted people, like I said, I think is a little bit opaque to non-disabled people who haven't thought about it that much, with the expectation that obviously many of us can walk and stand and that sort of thing. But what I find, for my example, to use myself as an example, is that I have a little bit of sight, but when I'm on a bus or a tram or anything, if it's crowded especially, I find I'm very likely to be in somebody's way without knowing. It's not always clear like where it's good to stand. People don't always, even with my white cane, don't seem to notice that I can't see very well and think that I'm kind of being difficult or hostile to them on purpose. There's a lot of potential stress involved with just kind of being jostled around by people you can't see or people you might, don't mean to. Obviously, to an extent, that's inevitable sometimes, but a lot of that can be avoided by having a seat. It definitely reduces my levels of stress and anxiety on a journey, which, like we've been saying, have enough reason to be elevated anyway. So anything that can take that away obviously helps. And so I think that the outcome of a priority seating, I think one of the things that we'd be interested in is making it as visually distinct as possible for those of us like me with some sight. So the kind of garish colors you get on buses and trams, you could easily pick a different one for the priority seats or for the signs behind them, if someone's in that seat. And also maybe even sometimes you see on like accessible toilets now signs that say things like not all disabilities are visible. I think making it obvious to the people who might be sitting in those priority seats. The last time I was in London, I've really struggled on the tube, and not just because of my sight. I'm also recovering from having broken my ankle last year, so there is also that other things might happen to us as well that are unrelated to our disability, and that made it more difficult to stand. But also the priority seats were taken by people who I think thought I couldn't see them at all because of my weight cane, but who I could tell were looking at me and kind of going, no, I don't need to move for him. You could almost see the decision as they were making it, going, I don't want to stand up. So I think an understanding that you can always ask. Maybe sometimes I have been offered a seat and I'll say, no, thanks, I don't need it. But it's just a nice way, I think, for the general public to be involved. You might not even have to give up your seat. You never know. So I think better understanding among the public of what priority seats benefit is, especially some of these like lesser understood benefits like to blind and partially sighted people, would be really welcome.
Thank you. And can I also ask you, because TfL obviously gives out the badges that says please offer me a seat, have they been useful?
I don't know if we have any data on that specifically. I'm happy to look into that and come back to you.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask Emma the same question? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just picking up, guys, I did want to mention the please offer me a seat badges. And I wanted to compare that to the comment raised by David about the sunflower lanyard. I think there are many, I think TfL, I've said that they've issued 100,000 of those please offer me a seat badges, but that requires disclosure of either a pregnancy or a disability or whatever it might be. That means that you need priority seating, and that can be really uncomfortable. And I think, as David said, there's a reluctance among disabled people to wear a badge if they have an invisible disability, because it makes it visible and it can change attitudes towards them that are potentially more hostile attitudes. In terms of the priority seating, I absolutely agree with Eric that there is more that needs to be done to promote that not all disabilities are visible, and if someone asks you for that seat, or if you do see a sunflower lanyard or a badge, that passengers are encouraged to give up that space. We don't see that happening very much. In all honesty, we hear quite a lot of disabled people sort of feeling very uncomfortable and unwilling to speak to other passengers out of fear of the attitudes that person could have. So what I would like to see from the deep dive is actions on the part of TfL to change public opinion or to try and have an awareness raising campaign. We saw that really effectively, I think, or at least somewhat effectively during the pandemic, in encouraging people to wear masks or accepting that some people chose to wear masks for longer than was necessary and to be respectful of other passengers. I'd like to see something like that, see something happen similarly to that, in terms of priority seating, and absolutely echo Eric's point around any signage that is brought in is heavily user tested with a range of disabled people, particularly those with a visual impairment, to make sure that it's usable by as many people as possible.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And David, you talked a little earlier about people not wanting perhaps to wear the lanyards at times. I didn't know whether you had any reflections on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, the more priority seats, the better, particularly buses. This seems to be one of the areas where there is a lot of friction. The other thing just on that is it's really useful to have card readers near the priority seats in some buses and some. The seat is accessible, but the card reader means you have to travel quite a way to get to it and from, and you may miss that seat if there's competition for it, which there does seem to be a lot of. Definitely, the more common they are and the more often they're used, the more you'll find the discrimination and stigma will go. We find that with everything. Certainly people with mental health problems, because they've experienced so much discrimination historically, they're really unlikely to wear markers. And I have to say, I've used mental health services for far more years than I've had hearing difficulties. I didn't get one of these till I had hearing difficulties. And when I'm asked why I wear it, it's because of hearing difficulties, not because of my mental health problems. And I'm head of research for the Mental Health Foundation. So, even I would choose to use that because I don't feel comfortable always with complete strangers talking about that. So I absolutely understand that. But the more provision we make and the more accessible we make those, the better. For our people living with dementia, balance can be an issue. Yeah. So again, there's no obvious visual reason why you might need to sit down with dementia, but actually if you have real trouble with your balance, then it's really important. Same with hearing. That's why I will sometimes use them. The other thing I would say is that I think the Metropolitan line must be disproportionately polite. Or I just look particularly needy because I routinely get offered seats and I see offers of seats made a lot on our line. So there are lots of kind, polite people out there. And it's also worth saying that being kind to others is good for your mental health, and there is evidence for that. So every act of kindness that you do for other people is good for your mental health as well. So encouraging that kind of kindness. I know it sounds twee, but actually it's really important. And certainly people with dementia and people with mental health problems really appreciate kindness. Whether it's from staff or members of the public, and I think that's underappreciated, and that makes such a difference. Just this morning, someone was just really nice to me when I was looking a bit baffled at a change. That just made my life a little bit easier and nicer.
Thank you. And I think this is something we'll take it with TfL. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblymember McCartney. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. What you just said actually really was quite profound, actually. I went on a journey recently with Bus Users UK, and some of the information they told me there was that 1 in 4 people are getting on buses just because they're lonely in London, which is shocking. It's a shocking number, but it just shows you the amount of people just want to get out of the house and just sit on a bus so that somebody would just look at them and smile and say hello and they got someone to talk to. Is just kind of develops that point that you've just made, and why it's so important that we have accessibility and access to the transport, the information that we need to get around. And one of the things that I found interesting from our brief that we got on an FOI, that it was the most complaints do tend to be about buses, which is a real shame considering the importance they have. On that issue of on information particularly, and I again with Buses is UK, they were saying that the problem is also accessing information, particularly with bus travel. How could we improve things? I mean, is it easy at the moment just using the app? Is that a good way forward? Are we doing well with the app? I know it's got lots of awards, but you mentioned digital exclusion earlier. You know, it's not going to be accessible for everyone. What could we do better?
I think there are definitely good apps around there, and they're particularly helpful for people who use them if they're unfamiliar with places, and people can also use them to kind of model their routes and almost practice their routes in their mind and do it beforehand. So making people more aware of it, and they can be, you know, if you have a good device that you can make accessible for you, that can work really well. We've also found, again, particularly people living with dementia, they use digital assistants a lot. And the thing they love about the digital assistants, unlike their carers, is they don't get cross or impatient if you ask them the same thing time and time again. They just get better at answering it. And both people living with dementia and people who live with them really like those kind of accessible tools when they work. So again, it's being aware of what they are and what they can do, and having help with them. But I would say they're not a substitute for really friendly staff.
Yeah.
Or really friendly passengers.
What about the information actually when you use the information from the boards themselves? There are, you know, it can be confusing on which side of the road you need to be on for a bus. You know, what could we do better there? What do you think?
Certainly clear and consistent style of information. That's the thing. A lot of stations are different. The styles of boards are different. Even things like which side of steps you go up and down can sometimes vary within the same station. I mean, one of the great things that happened during the pandemic is that a lot of effort was put into making one-way routes clear up and down stairs. They've all kind of been trodden off now. That really helped particularly people with dementia who really like clear, this is the route I take to get from A to B. And when platforms are clearly marked and numbered, you get told to go to platform 4. It's not always clear where platform 4 is unless you know what platform 4 is. So having the platforms marked clearly. A lot of the digital signs are really quite small, and sometimes they blur if you don't concentrate on them well enough. So having that clarity is really, really helpful, and having consistent look and feel would be really, really helpful. And I know that is something that you could do across London. You can't do it across the UK, but you definitely could do it across London to have, you know, a clarity. The tube map is brilliant because it has a style and a consistency that we've got used to for many, 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 many years. And having that kind of consistency really helps people.
I'm so glad you mentioned consistency, because another thing that I've been alerted to is the change of train station and tube station names. Particularly for people who are neurodiverse. So there's been a recent change because of a brand deal to do with Fashion Week. So Bond Street and Old Street have become Burberry Street and Fold Street. Oh, I love your expression, but that's what's happened. And what impact does that have on somebody who is neurodiverse? And has there been any consultation with groups before those decisions were being made?
I definitely no awareness of any consultation. I'm Bond Street. I'm stunned. I mean, I feel bereft somehow. I felt bad enough when the Oval became the Kia Oval, but that's another story. I think that's going to really confuse people, and I think there's going to be a lag between the language people have in their head, and if that becomes the way you do your journey planning by putting, You know, if you can't put Bond Street into your journey planner,
You can still.
you can still.
It was only on the platform.
It's only on the platform. There will be people. There will be people who suddenly worry when they look up, or they're on the train and they see that and they think, "Is this where I get off or not?" Or what on earth line am I on that I'm suddenly I've blinked, I've dozed off a bit, and I'm at this station. I'm at Burberry. I mean, genuinely, that's the kind of thing that would send me into a bit of a spiral. And I think certainly people living with dementia, and certainly people with some mental health difficulties or ADHD or SED would really struggle
I think
with
the
that.
point here is consultation and time,
Yeah.
and enough information to get out there that, you know, it's only going to be a change in these certain areas or this specific time. And it's getting that information out that's the most important part, isn't it? To make sure, particularly for people who are neurodiverse, if you've got the information, then you can plan.
Yeah.
It's that surprise element that is the problem, isn't it?
And again, I mean, we're always happy to help. I know plenty of voluntary sector organisations are really happy to help, but we don't notice everything. And sometimes we only hear about stuff when we get complaints from people rather than being proactively
I'm
contacted.
hearing this again. It's the after effect. That's when you're either alerted to the issues or have or can alert the issues, and that's the problem, isn't it? What we need to do is do better before these decisions are being made, rather than dealing with them afterwards. I can see some nodding heads from our other guests. So would you like to come in about the need for better accessibility to information, particularly for and on those other issues that we've just been discussing with David? I don't mind who goes first. Eric, you were nodding away.
Yeah,
but,
I got myself off mute quicker. That'll do. I absolutely. I mean, you can imagine the impact this has on blind and partially sighted people for whom the physical information and the digital information might not always be accessible anyway. So then, when you find that information is incorrect or out of date, I mean, the last time I was in London, I had to get a bus that had been diverted, and the app told me the right thing. It said go to this bus stop to get the number whatever bus, but the number whatever bus wasn't listed as stopping at that stop normally, and then. And it worked out all right, but only with stopping every bus, asking all the drivers, none of whom knew anything about this, getting other passengers to help. Like, it was a real collective effort. I was worried I was at the beginning of a musical. So it worked out, but with, again, a lot of stress. So I think there's something about consistency and provision of information, again, in terms of how it looks, where to find it. I live in Manchester, which is in the process of franchising its buses under the B name. So all the labeling is yellow now. There's yellow on all the stops, and the buses are all going to be yellow, and that's really brilliant. I know I'm seeing so many more bus stops than I used to, just when I'm like walking along, because they've all got yellow branding on them now. That kind of thing might not feel like much, but it can make a big difference. So I'm absolutely here for consistency, and yeah, absolutely the need to be consulted early on. We have the same problem of finding out about things once they happen and they don't work, and people aren't happy, aren't able to make the journeys that they want to or need to. So very happy to be included as early as possible in future.
would you like to add anything else to that, Emma?
Just that we at Transport Borough were quite heavily critical of TfL for the recent Gold Street renaming. The Burberry Street example was about a year or so ago, and we raised this with TfL then, saying, particularly on those who are neurodiverse, how they're going to be impacted by the change of name. We weren't informed of that instance prior to it happening, but we also weren't informed of the Gold Street. So we ended up actually writing a letter to the commissioner, sort of expressing our outrage that this has happened again, and that we weren't consulted, even though at Transport Borough we have regular meetings with the TfL stakeholder engagement team. They weren't informed of this publicity stunt either, and I think it's really crucial that the committee is aware that an equality impact assessment also wasn't done prior to the activation of the launch of changing Gold Street station name, as well as, and this was my particular concern, for me that I didn't see get picked up elsewhere was the street furniture was brought in. It was sort of a telephone box at a 90-degree angle to play on the whole fold theme. And the safety concerns I had around that were crucial. And I think in terms of not just consulting with organizations like ourselves, but that station is very near Moorfields Eye Hospital, and no one in a patient engaging role was told or consulted prior to that activation, either that was going to be happening and causing major, in my view, major safety concerns for disabled people and visually impaired people trying to navigate that station with these new street fixtures put in and having no equality impact assessment done and no consultation with disabled people prior to that activation, I think is quite honestly appalling.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme about this lack of consultation early on. Just one very quick point from David. You were talking about that consistency. Do you think, you said it could happen here in London, do you think that consistency is lacking at the moment between inner and outer London at the moment, particularly with bus travel? That's something that I've been
hugely.
notified about.
The difference between where I work around London Bridge and where I live around Chesham is night and day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblymember Curry. And just before we move on to the next couple of questions, I'd like to welcome students from Ekota Academy in Ilford. Yes. Thank you. We are talking about access for disabled people and transport in London, and you're very welcome. Thank you very much. And we are very behind, Assembly members, just to remind you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. And this question is for Emma. Kind of noting your report from 2023, Are We There Yet? And focusing in on pavements. So what should TfL be prioritising to improve our street spaces to make walking and wheeling easier for disabled people?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So London in that report came out as one of the worst regions actually in terms of pavement quality. We had 38% of London respondents said that the most significant barrier they faced to walking and wheeling was the pavement quality. We also found that Londoners were more likely to say street clutter is a barrier. And I think it was touched on earlier by Eric in terms of micro-mobility, so e-scooters, bikes, hire bikes, etc. At the moment, the lack of regulation of that industry and the lack of consistency over how users of those micro-mobility modes should be, docking or parking their vehicles at the end of the use. That's a huge issue. So I'd love to see some regulation of that industry. And I think also not to say that disabled people can't also really benefit from micro-mobility. For a lot of disabled people, we know that an e-scooter is to them their mobility aid. And it's incredibly important that they have access to it and that it allows them to walk and wheel much more easily. So I'd love to see the sector also try and be more inclusive to disabled people. But in terms of what can be done, I think really addressing the pavement quality is hugely important, and then also addressing street clutter is huge.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the issue of pavements. As a councillor in Islington, I have constituents who've fallen and hurt their face, broken a nose just from tripping on an uneven paving stone. So as people get older, or if they are sight impaired, then it's that can just something as small as a sort of half centimetre trip, sort of gap, or height difference on paving slabs can make a real difference to someone's ability just to walk to the bus stop or and to feel safe doing that. So totally endorse everything you say about the quality of the pavements and the street clutter and the line bike issue. I think London councils and TfL are trying to work on something at the moment because there is no consistency from one borough to another about what the arrangements are. And as a ward councillor in Islington, my inbox is constantly full of complaints about bikes being badly dumped and causing trip hazards that are very damaging. Now, in your Are We There Yet report, you mentioned that I think it was 77% of people found issues with the quality of pavements. 44% of people said there weren't enough crossings and safe places to just get across the road, which is another sort of huge barriers. And I think you estimated that about 96% of disabled people face a barrier when they leave the house, encountering the streets. So what do you think London needs to do to rapidly make a difference on that? And do you think there are ways that we should be working with disabled Londoners, older Londoners and different groups in order to kind of get the information about those changes to TfL so they can act?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's pavement, as you said, cannot be underestimated as a barrier for disabled people. But what I think is missing from the conversation that we're having, and also the conversation more widely, is there is so much interest and investment and opportunity right now to encourage sustainable transport. And disabled people would love to be included in those discussions. And if that does make things like active travel, so whether that's walking, wheeling, or cycling, more of an option, you need to include disabled people in that. And disabled people that we surveyed, over 70% said that they would like to take more sustainable modes of transport, but they're unable to because of access barriers. And that's access barriers to public transport, but also to walking and wheeling. I think that what ultimately needs to happen is for, like you said, that engagement with disabled people to understand where are the very severe areas, and particularly looking at what is around the area. So we've heard from disabled people that there might be a sort of pothole on the pavement, but if they were to cross the street to go to the other side, there may not be a drop curb. So in that case, how is a disabled person meant to get to their destination? Well, they have to completely reroute their journey, and that takes so much more time and planning, and you don't know what the quality of those pavements are going to be. So I think really looking at the impact that it's having on disabled people is absolutely crucial.
Thank you. That's coming across loud and clear, and I'm sure we'll be feeding that back to TfL. I'm going to pass back to the chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Russell. Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief. Eric, if I could ask you this question. Could you give me your views on what your organisation's feelings are about floating bus stops, and could you let me know, or let the committee know, about any kind of engagement that was had with your organisation before they were introduced?
I have only had the job that I've had for about 3 years, so I didn't have it at the time that floating bus stops were introduced. So I'm happy to I will consult and get back to you on that point if I can. Our view on them is that as they are currently designed, they're not accessible for people with sight loss because they don't offer any way to determine when a bike is in the cycle lane, basically in front of the bus stop, the part that you need to use. We have done, like I said, we recently did a kind of guided walk with Will Norman and Seb Dance in central London and one of the main things we wanted to talk about was floating bus stops, because it's such an issue, and it's such a kind of emotive one as well. It's been going on for a long time. There hasn't really been much progress in terms of how to make them more accessible to blind and partially sighted people. various a lot has been done, again, without that consultation with us, without that like input, I think, from people who are most affected by this. We do have reports of people who say, you know, because there tend to be only one or two bus stops, say, near your home that you might be able to reasonably get to start a journey. If those become inaccessible, it really does rule out almost any independent travel for blind and partially sighted people in that position. So we are starting to work after the walk with Will Norman and Subdance. We are having a little bit of engagement with Active Travel England, who I understand are undertaking a review on floating bus stops. And again, it's been really, really welcome to be involved early on in that process. We're very aware of the differing kind of almost access needs that need to be accounted for. Like things like the lack of curbs on the cycle lanes helps people with wheeled mobility aids, and you know, but the lack of curbs means it's very dangerous for blind and partially sighted people who don't have any sense of where the cycle lane is meant to be versus where the pavement and the bus stop are meant to be, things like that. So it's a complex issue. Our feeling is that there hasn't been enough engagement with people with sight loss to make them accessible or safe for us as it currently is, and we're certainly hoping that that can be improved upon.
Thank you, it's very helpful. Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Assembly Member Prince. And yeah, we'd really welcome any information on previous engagement that the RNLB had. Sorry, David, you had indicated you wanted to come in previously, and that's my fault, I forgot.
No, not a problem.
Yeah,
just on crossings particularly, a couple of things that did come up. One is again, it's a consistency issue. Some pedestrian crossings have the bleeping and some don't. And people have got used to the kind of bleeping, meaning it's safe to cross and go across, and certainly that came through with people with dementia and so on, and I guess it may be an issue for people with visual disabilities. That just seems to have vanished on some crossings, and we don't know why or whether there's a consistency issue on that, but that would be helpful. And also just policing crossings, because at the moment the risk of being flattened as you cross the road when the light's green, usually by someone on a cycle with a delivery bag on the back, is something that is really making people very anxious and nervous for road crossing. So I guess those two things, consistent marking and indications, audio-visual indications for crossings would be really helpful, and more robust policing of traffic regulations in crossings would also really reduce anxiety and increase safety on those kind of between pavement bits.
That's really helpful, and thank you for coming in on that. We did have a question that we were going to ask about Navalens trial to Eric. If it's okay, we're going to address that to you in writing, just because
I think that's a good idea.
Thanks very much.
If you wouldn't mind me saying one quick thing about the crossings, I know we're over time, but to address David's point, there is actually a reason why they don't all make a noise. If there's more than one crossing kind of within earshot of where a person might be, they don't beep, so that you don't accidentally think that the beeping you're hearing might be coming from your one, when actually it's one perpendicular to that, and you might have cars in front of you at the time, if that makes sense. So that is actually part of how they work. So they cannot all make a noise, but they should all have tactile cones underneath the button. That might help some of your colleagues with dementia. That is almost always present on a crossing. That obviously also helps people with dual sensory loss, and that's much more reliable, if that's any help to you. And on the subject of crossings too, RNIB has a report that's a couple of years old now, from 2021, but still very relevant, about streets, and that particularly says curbs and crossings and pavement clutter are the three biggest things that blind and partially sighted people find impact their walking journeys. And if you don't have that, I'm happy to send that along to the committee.
Thanks, that's a really helpful clarification. It means we can be clear about what's going on.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. It's a complicated issue, and a lot of us don't understand it. I only learned this a couple of years ago, so.
Thank you for educating us. Assembly Member Turrell.
Thank you, Chair. What steps would you like to see TfL take to make sure that its stakeholder engagement is accessible and inclusive to all? If we start with Eric, then go David, and then Emma.
Oh gosh, I think blind and partially sighted people have a lot of different access needs. So I think making your engagement accessible in different forms is always welcome. Doing things online, doing things in person, having things available in as many different formats, because the thing about visual impairments is that anything you can say about what works for one person will be contradicted by somebody with a different sort of visual impairment. So unfortunately, I can't say, oh, put everything online or anything like that. So a diversity of tactics is definitely most welcome. And again, I think just kind of ongoing commitment. What we're finding is that people really want to tell us about their good and especially bad experiences with transport and streets. And one of the things that keeps them from feeding back, apart from the accessibility of the process, is not knowing if it will make any difference. We have so many of these kinds of experiences and limited time and energy to address them. What helps is to know that what will be done with the information that's being given, and especially if you can come back to people and say, because of you telling us that X was important, we've done Y, and that kind of thing really, really makes a difference in the quality of the engagement that you can expect as well.
Yeah, I think the diversity of approaches is really important, making sure that there is plenty of time for it. A lot of people we work with would want to go out and consult a group before feeding in. So if you want good input from people with mental health problems or people with dementia, plenty of time so that they can go back to their peer groups, their support groups, and they can do it in a nice, accessible way. Really good monitoring of who is being consulted with, so you can spot gaps. We noticed with our work, for example, there were significant differences in responses we got from people from different racialized groups. And that's really important. And if you don't know where your feedback's coming from, you don't know what you're missing. So being conscious of what language you use, making it accessible in a variety of languages, and a variety of accessible approaches. And I would absolutely underline the feedback thing. People are more likely to get involved a second time if they can see what happened as a result of the first time.
Emma?
I would really echo the previous points made, that the range of contact and engagement methods is absolutely crucial. But I think also what is also needed is to ensure that a range of impairments are engaged with, because I think, as Eric said, there can be instances where the needs of different impairment groups may conflict with each other, but there are solutions to those conflicts. There are definitely ways to prioritize what needs to be prioritized amongst the incredibly diverse disabled community. And so I would say making sure the breadth of impairments and the breadth of disabled people engaged with is absolutely crucial.
Excellent, thank you for those. Are there any examples that stick out to you that you'd like to share with the committee where TfL have done particularly well on the engagement front, or equally any examples of where they've done badly you'd like to kind of share with the committee? Again, if we start with David this time.
I mean, we were so impressed when we had the opportunity to present our research results at King's Cross Station, and the support we got to do that. That reached a lot of people who wouldn't even have thought about transport and mental health. So, I mean, I had to get up at 4 a.m. I had to set up before commuter time, and I couldn't take things down until all the computers had gone home. But the actual support there was to do something like that on a real station with real people, with tens of thousands of passers-by, was a really, really good example. And I think we changed a good few minds, both staff and passengers, by doing that. So those kind of being more public about all this stuff, so that it isn't, obviously it's really important that you talk to experts and people with lived experience of all sorts of things, but if you get broader public engagement in this, that will make your job so much easier, because it's actually broader public behaviour that makes almost as much difference as the infrastructure and the staff. So getting people on board as to why priority spaces are important, why passenger assistance is important, why following one-way systems is important, why gaps are like they are. That kind of broader public engagement will make everything so much easier, because actually this this week's members of the public and next week's disabled people.
Thank you. Emma, do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Forgive me, I have just lost my notes. There we go. So I would say something that has gone well is, we have maintained a critical friend relationship with TfL over a number of years. I would say that sometimes we do have our feedback acted on and really taken on board and really listened to. We recently had the opportunity to present to their executive committee the findings of our read area report, which was fantastic. What I would just stress again that a recent example of what has not gone well is the prioritization of the money from the Samsung partnership to change the Old Street to Fold Street station, as well as those street fixtures, was a really poor example of engagement with all relevant individuals in prioritizing that brand deal over the safety and the needs of disabled passengers, albeit for a short time.
And Eric?
Again, a lot of the TfL engagement is done by a colleague of mine, but I think what stands out to me is recently, again, being part of the guided walk with Will Norman and Seb Dance, and just the willingness of them to make loads of notes. They were really positive, really, actively engaged with everything we were saying, and really seemed to understand it, and went away like the same day to kind of send emails and get us in touch with Active Travel England about the floating bus stop review and that sort of thing. And again, getting involved early on in that sort of work rather than finding out about something when it's too late makes all the difference. So I think that's a great example for us recently of engagement with TfL.
Thank you. That's me done, so back to the chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Turrell. And then finally, very briefly, Assembly Member Russell.
Yeah, I think we've got about 2 minutes. So at our meeting in July, Caroline Stickland from Chief Exec at Transport for All told us that there was an issue with consultation fatigue. And so I think disabled people's organisations feeling, okay, now they want to hear from us, but this is kind of like it's relentless. So I just wondered very briefly, is there anything that TfL could be doing to reduce that consultation fatigue while still working effectively with disabled people's organisations? Who wants to? You've got seconds, really, but Emma.
Sure. I'll just jump in really, really quickly. I would say that showing people the outcome of their contributions is crucial, because, like Eric has said a number of times, disabled people will make complaints, will give feedback, and nothing changes. Showing us a change that has been made due to feedback or due to the strength of feeling on an issue is the best way to show that their sharing of views and experience actually matters.
Thank you. That's a really, and I can see people nodding, that's a really positive piece of feedback that we can give to TfL. Is there anything critical that either of you want to add? We've got to be super brief. Yeah. David?
Coming to us rather than expecting us to come to you.
Thank you. That's also very, very good point. Fabulous. Did Eric, did you want to add?
Very quickly, as part of the Streets report I was just talking about from a couple of years ago, out of that we made a thing called the Key Principles of Inclusive Street Design, specifically designed to make these consultations less repetitive, but not asking us the same things all the time. We're saying, here's what we want you to include. Do this stuff, and then we won't bother you so much, and you don't need to bother us so much. I'm very happy to share that with the committee.
That would be fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Chair, back to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to all our guests for their responses. Sorry for hurrying you a little at the end. And just to say that those issues of consultation are really, really important to us. And if there is any more information you'd like to share with us, then please do. We will also be asking for evidence from other organisations. not too distant future. And also we were going to ask you more about training. I know you for staff we covered that. We will also, if that's okay, write to you to see if you have any more information on that. Thank you very much for bearing with us. We'll now take a short adjournment, 5 minutes, just so we can move on to the second part of discussion. And thank you again so much to our guests for your time and your evidence. Welcome back to the Transport Committee and our discussion on accessibility and inclusion in transport planning. For this second panel, we're joined by Paul Herriotts, who's Director for the National Centre for Accessible Transport, and Nick Tyler, the Director for the UCL Centre for Transport Studies. And thank you for joining us. So I'm going to ask the first question. And the question is, how important is engagement with stakeholders for designing an accessible and inclusive transport network? And what do you think this engagement should look like? Would anyone like to? Paul, would you like to go for that?
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to start with. It's a pleasure to see you all, and a pleasure to realise that you're considering this important kind of topic. So it's absolutely vital. So I have a product design background, a transport design background, and I'm always saying to people, you can't add on accessibility afterwards. You can't add on inclusivity. These things have to start on day one. And when we are designing something, we really need to engage on day one with that end user group, whether we're talking about accessibility or not. So in any product, we need to know who are our customers and to engage with them to better understand what their needs and wants are and how they will use that product. And in particular, we need to have an understanding of the variation of that population. So, even normally we look around a room and we see a great variety. I'm not typical of the people coming to talk today. Is there anyone here that feels they're typical of someone who works in this building? We all are individuals with such a variation that we need to engage with those people, and we need to understand that huge variation that people have and the lived experience that they bring in order to start any project. So for me, it's absolutely key, and I can talk and talk and talk about that. So I'll let Nick have a word, and then you can come back to me.
Similarly, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. I totally agree with that. I think the way I see this is what I call co-cultivation. So the idea of cultivation as a term for this is rather like a farmer preparing the fields for sowing. So I would start before day one. I think it's actually about preparing the grounds and getting the conversations with people going. Then you start your design work, working out what it is you're going to be designing. Then you're planting your seeds. You then let the plants nurture. You could do that. You harvest. You then prepare the ground for the next thing. So it's an ongoing process. And I think one of the difficulties we have with accessibility and inclusion in transport is we see transport a lot like a series of projects. They may be very big projects, could be the Elizabeth line, or they could be huge projects, but it's a project. And at the end of the project, it all stops. And actually, the world goes on. People still have to engage. And so really, it's a question of how do we actually create that continuing kind of cultivation, the ongoing thought of what we're doing is we're growing a better society for the future. And how do we actually do that? It starts from understanding who the people are. And I agree with Paul, there isn't a norm. I think I would try and get rid of the word normal if I can, because what is it? It's actually only been around for 100 or 2 years as a concept that actually everybody is an individual. We all have an equal status in humanity. So why are we excluding people? Because for some measure they fall on the outside. And so we need to understand much, much more about our communities, about our people, so that we actually include people as not as if they're an exception because they happen to have some set of capabilities, but because they are people, and bring them all in, but on a much, much more continuing basis. And I think that way we can start to get a better understanding of what people really want and what they really need and what they're trying to do to live their lives.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Paul, did you want to come
can
back
I
in?
add
Yes,
to that?
Of course.
Because we're in good agreement here. There's not going to be a fight in the. It's actually normal to be different. Is what we should be saying. So we need to celebrate that diversity, that variation. We shouldn't view it as that's a problem group of people. We need to understand that people are bringing a rich variety of experiences to anything that they do, and to try and be as inclusive as we can in considering those. And as Nick's saying, you know, this process of engagement, we really need to make sure when we talk about co-design that it's not a one-off. It's not that on Wednesday I'm meeting with a group of whoever it is, but we continue to engage, as Nick's been describing with his farming analogy, we continue to engage with those people. It's not a one-off, it's not one event, it's getting to understand them, getting to understand their needs and wants. It's undertaking idea generation events, it's co-designing. So it's actually, you know, running ideas, developing ideas with the user group, and it's using that user group to develop the product. And then on day one, that product or service should work. And as we all know, you know, once you've built something, we can't just move that girder 100 mil to the left. It's going to be rather expensive. So we really need to do this development up front with the people who are going to be using those products and services. And you know, while I'm on my high horse, they are really the experts in their lives, and they bring that lived experience. I'm sure that we've got a few letters after our name on this table, but that's of real no consequence when I'm trying to consider somebody else's lives. They're the expert in their own life, and we need to bring them, and they need to be equal in the design process with the design professionals to co-design a solution.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and we'll definitely be asking you a little bit more, digging into some of those. So thanks very much for that instruction. And Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Are there any examples that you're aware of where you feel that engagement hasn't worked well, and what reasons why?
I'm glad you asked that question, because it's a lot harder to find where it does work well. I think the one of the challenges is that there is not a one size fits all. So there isn't a formula that says do this and you've got your engagement right. I think it has to be engaging. You have to. It's like gears. So it can't just be somebody saying, I am engaging with you because I happen to be in the same room or something like that. So it will be very different in different circumstances. And I think the sorts of ways that it tends to fail is because somebody gets left out, is probably the major one. And we've kind of learnt over the years, well, there are people with sight loss, there are people with wheelchairs. Neurodiversity is a classic example, I think, of a group that is nobody quite understands who they are. They don't quite understand how to talk with them. So I think the kind of example I give isn't here is a project that it was really bad, because I don't think that's actually very helpful. But I think I would say where specific groups have been kind of left out of the discussion from the beginning, and then, as Paul has said, it's really hard to retrofit afterwards. So I think there is it's about that kind of exclusion.
Thank you, Keith. Can I add to that? So thank you, Nick. I concur with that. And I just sort of building on that answer, you know, in academic life we talk about sampling, you know, when we're taking a selection of people who represent a bigger population. And I think often one sees in projects a very small group of people has been consulted, and I use the word consulted instead of engaged with, so perhaps a lesser form of engagement. And we really have to think also about intersectionality. So we're not just thinking about a pan-disability group, but we might be thinking about other attributes like age and gender and, you know, country of origin and suddenly to be talking to 3 or 5 people, how can 5 people represent the population of London in a project? How can 10 or 20 people represent them? So we really have to understand who we are engaging with, and you know, what experience they're bringing. And In my life at the National Centre for Accessible Transport, one of the things we've done is to set up a pan-disability panel of people that we use in projects, the likes of which Nick and I are describing. And I think as of a couple of weeks ago, we got up to around 1,600, 1,700, and we have great ambitions to get that up to, perhaps 10,000. And the reason to have such ambition is that you need a huge pool of people to select from in order to undertake a rural project in Wales or a project in central London or. Because there are so many factors and so many variables. So I think, Keith, to answer your question, it's to do with, so engagement is something that, we're very keen on. We advocate engagement. However, it needs to be done well and it needs to be done thoughtfully.
That's really helpful. Also, just briefly, because it's a really big open question, but just like in a nutshell, your views on how accessible and inclusive do you think London public transport is?
I think it tries very hard. I think I would, in many ways, TfL is a leader in the world in this area. I think we should always start there because they have done a massive amount. When they decided to almost break the bus manufacturing industry by lowering the floor of all the buses in London in 3 years or whatever it was, that was a massive statement about recognising that they've got an underground system which was going to be formidable to try and make it accessible, but you could make the buses accessible, but that meant taking some very bold decisions very early on the bus system. I think London, we shouldn't be knocking on London. I think London, you can always do better, and I think TfL is very good at trying to find its way through things. So I think we're starting from a good place in London. I think there's always more that can be done, and the question would be how best to direct that progress. But I think it is important to realise we are starting from actually quite a good place. You go outside London, you really see the difference, and I think it's important to see that.
Can I just add to that? So, because I'm not in London, can I be more direct? So, what have I just jotted down here? So we do research, nationwide. So I will frame this as a nationwide thing rather than point it at London, but you can take from it what I'm trying to say. So we see amazing pockets of excellence, as Nick is describing. Some things work fantastically well. They're good people who've done good projects. What we don't see is those are widely adopted. And what transport users tell us is that, transport generally is suboptimal and it's inconsistent. So someone can make 5 rail journeys and have 5 different experiences. And that's going to the same place. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, something happened on Thursday, the lifts weren't working. On Wednesday, the ramp wasn't there, and whatever else. And it's the inconsistency that catches people out. And what may be inconvenient for some of the people in the room today can be a deal breaker for someone who has a severe impairment. So I think, I concur with Nick, there's great stuff and there's some real exemplar projects in London, but it's not everywhere, it's not widespread enough. And I think the lack of consistency and the lack of, we talk about in academia in trust in systems, I think if you have a bad experience, and, we recently heard, didn't we, with Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson and her experiences, and suddenly we're all talking about it. If you have an experience like that, how likely are you to get on a train again? So it may be only 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, but it only needs to be in order for people to lose trust in the system. So that inconsistency really catches people out.
If I could just add to that, I think that's absolutely right. But I think one of the exemplars to me of where there's a problem that hasn't been addressed, and it isn't just London, would be the bus stop. And you have a problem because you have a bus. The bus is made by a bus manufacturer to a specification which is dictated by regulation. very, very largely to be accessible as you can kind of get a bus to be, and there's issues around that. But there is the bus. You have this piece which is owned by a bus operator through TfL's contracting arrangements and so on. So that's all specified. You have a bus stop which is on an environment which is owned by a local authority. And there is nothing that says the two have to meet. And so the bus manufacturers will satisfy the national regulation because they have to. There is no national regulation for the bus stop. TfL has some ideas, but they're kind of driven by pragmatism because they realise they can't quite get it right. So they don't want to be too difficult on the local authority by forcing issues with the design of the bus stop. You can design a bus stop to be accessible with a bus, but it will cost you money. And there are 20,000 bus stops in London. It's the first point of contact with public transport that people will have. And I think, if I had a bottomless pit, which I don't, that's where I would put the money, because it's the start of the journey into public transport is going to be a bus. In many, many cases, if you're into public transport, into using it, that's where you're going to start. And so, to my mind, that is something which could be done.
Dare I just add to that? I know you asked us to be brief, but I love those words, and I'm going to challenge slightly. So the research we do says every journey is multimodal. So in our previous answer, it's very easy, isn't it, to congratulate you about the Elizabeth line or whatever else. But you've got to get out of your front door and get down the something pavement. I can't swear in this room, can I? But you've got to get down the pavement, and we talk to people who, I can't go out on bin day. Okay, because the bins are out on the pavement. So, Nick's absolutely right. We need to get to the bus stop. So I start before the bus stop. How do I get out of my front door? And I have an ill-maintained pavement with dropped curbs in the wrong place, with people parking on the pavement, so public attitudes to disability. So that's the first thing that people have to navigate in order to get to the bus stop, which is possibly suboptimal, in order to get to your wonderful transport mode. So I think we need to consider every journey as being multimodal, and as with any chain, it's the weak link, so you can get caught out. So if it's bin day and there's bins and stops a wheelchair going down the pavement, you can't get onto that wonderful train line. So that's really, and just as I'm saying the same answer as Nick in a different way, yes, different people have different control of those things, but all those things are part of a journey. So it's whichever is less well delivered is going to determine the overall journey.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Assemblymember Prince. Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. My question is on co-production, or as you said, co-cultivation, which I think is much broader than just production. It's about the operation, monitoring and evaluation of it. It's an ongoing process. Can you just tell us what does good co-cultivation, co-production actually look like? And what are the barriers that an organisation like TfL might find in actually adopting good practice in that way?
Okay, well, I have a couple of examples, whether we get onto them both, but
please,
none of them from the UK.
Please give them, yeah.
Okay. So one example is in Japan, where a city, it's basically just outside Tokyo, a city decided to train the whole population, the whole population of the city to understand people with dementia, so that people living in what they call a group home of people with dementia could get on the bus, wander around the city, go and do things, and people in the city would understand if they were more than usually confused. They knew what to do. If they thought somebody was stressed, they could call the group home would come and get them. But that was about educating the entire city, and they did that through means of the high school students, by bringing the high school students together with the people with dementia to have ongoing programs together, talking about the history of the city, because obviously that's something which the people with dementia were able to communicate about. So the high school students became the means of communication to the rest of the city. They then have a city where people with dementia are free. And it's the only place I've seen where somebody with dementia felt free. So that's one example. The other example is in Colombia in South America, where it was a city which had real problems with drug gangs. And as part of resolving that problem, I won't go into all the history of that, but as part of resolving that problem, it became very apparent about the accessibility of the poorer regions of the city into the centre. So poorer regions, periphery, far out, upper mountain. And so they devised a transport system. They realized that mobility was a really important thing, devised a transport system to bring people from the poor periphery into the centre to involve them in the city. And that meant that had to be accessible. And you're going down probably about 500-600 meters down a mountain. So they brought in cable cars. And so the first one, and they consulted with everybody, and everybody was very excited about having their cable car, and it was very successful. And it meant instead of 2 hours to the city, it took 15 minutes, and everybody was very happy. So they went to another poor area, and they tried that, and so on. They got to the fourth one, and they said, we don't want a cable car, because we've looked at those cable cars, and they go over our heads. I know we have one next door. They go over our heads, and if you don't live near the station, you've still got to get up the mountain or down the mountain to the station. And so the city said to them, what would you like? And they said, we would like an escalator. So designing an escalator to go up 600 meters beats the Elizabeth line. So they did. They built this escalator in sections, because you'd have to do. So there's 6 sections. And each section is looked after by a team of school children. And they only get to look after this escalator if they go to school. If they don't go to school, they can't be there. All of this is about assistance and helping the people in the community, irrespective of any perceived disability, to join in the society of the city. And the accessibility was the means of being able to do that, and it was almost invisible. And that goes on all the time. Those school children grow up, and their children come in. The drivers, you'll love this one, the drivers of the metro line in that city are all university students. Why? Because the university students are learning how to be doctors of medicine. They're going to be the future businessmen, the future entrepreneurs, the future whatever's in the city. They get to see how important it is that everybody can move around the city, because they're driving the train that takes them. And I thought this was nonsense, so I went and asked a train driver, who was a second-year medical student, why they were doing it. And they just said, these are my patients. And you sort of realize that complete involvement in that process. And to my mind, that's kind of where that begins to work. And the last piece on that one, the traffic planners in that city, or the transport planners, I should say, in that city, they spend 4 days a week on the street, 1 day a week in the office. And when they're on the street, they wear a bright red jacket that says, I am a traffic planner. And I went out with them when they were doing this, and I could imagine that happening here. And the conversations were really interesting. Some of it was about transport, but a lot of it was about the football, it was actually joining the population of the city to the people who are essentially responsible for designing that city and making it happen. And getting that conversation, getting the relationship right, so that you could have a conversation with a transport planner about a difficult parking problem, because you kind of knew them. And it wasn't just some blank office somewhere. So I think, answer to your question, to my mind, is this sense of actually embedding inside everybody, the officials, but also the population's sense of the mobility and the transport is actually part of all of us, and we should all be engaging with it all the time. That's my examples.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Nick. I think you really need to fund Nick and I to go around the world. Anyway. I'll take you back to Coventry now for a moment. So a more kind of prosaic answer. I just wanted to tell you, what the ultimate is for me, because often when one looks at, co-production and looks on, we get out our dusty books as academics, and the first thing it says is have empathy for the user and all that kind of stuff. And I think we should take a step further and be more ambitious. And what we've done at Coventry University, where I'm based, is we have a PhD scheme. So both Nick and I, Nick in his university, I'm sure we would encourage people to come and learn how to be independent researchers, so they come and do a PhD. So we have PhD funding available to come and research into the field of accessible design, accessible transport design. But the funding is only available to people who have a lived experience of disability. So you have to be a disabled applicant in order to be eligible for funding. So, Joanne, for me, the ultimate here is, yes, we need to engage with disabled people, but we also need to put disabled people really at the heart of all these discussions that are being had about, decisions that are being made in amazing places like this, working in transport operators or Transport for London or, a bus design company or whatever else. We need to be training up and giving disabled people the right technical skills to sit within those meetings and in those environments, not only with their technical expertise, but with their lived experience of disability. And I think when you bring the two together, it's super powerful, and it's very difficult for people not to listen. So slightly answering your question slightly differently, but that for me is the ultimate. So yes, we're not there yet, and as we're not there yet, we need to really be, co-producing solutions with people. And as I said earlier, that means not one engagement, but continuous engagement. These are project members, and they have an equal status with people like Nick and I. We all bring our own experience and abilities to those meetings, and some of those people will be coming up with solutions. Often if you have a challenge in life, you become an expert at coming up with workarounds. You're quite good at designing solutions, so we should be asking those people to help us design those solutions over a continuous project. And as Nick said, that doesn't necessarily have to be time limited. We need to find a way of that being a continual kind of engagement.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that struck me about Nick's comments about the fourth city in an escalator is that probably wouldn't be very accessible to wheelchairs or other mobility users. So what would a good system look like when conflict arises between different user groups or different users? How does TfL deal with that? I mean, we've got the thorny problem at the moment, for example, of bypass bus stops, introduced in 2013, perhaps only recently really getting the attention they deserve. And we heard a little earlier that what might suit one group about not having a curb will not suit another, and so forth. So how, in this hopefully really good consultation, does someone like TfL deal with those conflicts?
I've just been doing some work for Guide Dogs on the bus stops, so they will be publishing that shortly. But I think the straight answer is there's always going to be some form of, I would hope not conflict, but compromise, or some issue where what one group is needing in order to be able to pass over something another group finds to be a barrier. And I think that is always going to happen. It happens with everybody. But I think the starting point is to have a conversation between all of the parties involved, so that there is a kind of understanding going on of what the issues are. And in my experience, where we've got the best kind of answers coming out of that is when the answers, rather as Paul is saying, the answers come from those people. Because a person with sight loss is not going to tell us that a person in a wheelchair can't do something. What happens is, they have that conversation where they can work out what works for each of them and what works for both, and then how they work it out. And the role for TfL is to listen. And I think they're not bad at listening, but I think we underplay listening. We prize expertise, but actually the best expertise to have is to listen. Yeah. And I think enabling groups that have challenging differences, the classic example is tactile paving and wheelchairs, for example. Yeah. And it is a difficult problem. If we had unlimited curb space, you could have crossings with tactile paving and crossings without tactile paving, but we don't. And so I think we need to understand where those compromises come, but enable the people to come up with not necessarily the technical solution, but they can come up with what they need. And then that's where your designers, that's where the people who've been to Coventry or UCL, that's where they come in and say, okay, so if that's what you need, let's have a talk about how we can do that. And then you can actually get that going. But I think that's where TfL's role is to bring the people together and stand back and listen, and then figure out how you then meet what the people are saying.
And Joan, just to add to that, is not to be afraid that there'll be a conflict, So I think that's a natural situation that may occur, and conflict perhaps is a strong word. What we're simply saying is we have people with different needs, and how do we come up with an elegant solution? Is there a one-size-fits-all? So that would be our first starting point, wouldn't it, in inclusive design? Is there a mainstream solution that we can really just extend the kind of boundaries of who we're accommodating? Sometimes that won't be possible, and we have to be pragmatic and perhaps have an add-on solution. But I think primarily let's try and accommodate everybody and see where we get. And I think one thing that also occurs to me that I'll just voice now in case it's not asked is to not put people into conflict in our designs. So we shouldn't be having a situation where a wheelchair user on a bus is fighting with a parent in a pushchair. So we've designed that to happen, haven't we? We've designed that to pitch people against each other. And for me, just by the way, that's an example of not engaging with people and not understanding better about intersectionality. So somebody said, okay, this is a space a wheelchair uses, and another person in another room said this is a space that a pushchair needs. And no one's ever spoken to a disabled person in a wheelchair to say, do you have a child that you take out? Oh, well, that's a very normal scenario, isn't it? So why is there only one space on a bus? So again, it's all about, just as Nick is saying, engaging with people to better understand them. That is the primary role, and a lot of the problems will fall away by doing so. Yes, there may be some residual challenges, but I think it's what we would advocate you do.
Thank you. And my last question then is, in the Equity in Motion paper from Transport for London, they state that they're going to establish a road inequalities alliance with boroughs, public health professionals and others to develop new approaches, including pilots, trials, community co-design and innovation by 2026. Now, I'm assuming you think that's a good idea, but on what scale should that be? And have you any examples where that's taking place elsewhere? And is that ambitious enough, I suppose I'm asking?
I think it's a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge. I would say, probably, if it were me, I would do a small trial, not because of not being ambitious, but because I think it needs to be got right, and we need to understand what's going into making it more or less difficult and challenging, and where. There's a huge number of issues going in just in that list. Yeah. And so I would think not doing it for the whole of London. I would find some area of London where you've got a reasonable range of those challenges and enough purchase that you can actually get involved at depth. Because to put something like that in place and monitor it to see if it's working is huge. So if you do it in too big a space, you just won't do the monitoring. You wouldn't be able to afford doing the monitoring. So I think doing it in a smaller space, if you make it too small, of course, then it's meaningless. So it needs to be it's difficult with London because you have such a variety in London. Across the boroughs, there aren't two identical. So you need to kind of find somewhere where it can be representative in some way to other boroughs, so it's not meaningless to them. I think outer London tends to suffer from not having so much attention paid to it. The whole transport system's designed to go into the centre, so it leaves the outer boroughs kind of a bit bereft. And maybe the Alto boroughs might be one of the places you could look at having that kind of intervention as a way of doing it. And it was slightly, in some ways, easier because it's less intense than the centre. So maybe an outer borough might be a better place to do it. But I think you need to have the comprehensivity of that approach. It needs to be big enough for that, but keep it as small as you can in order that the evaluation of it, in all the senses of the word value, not just the money, but the social value, the equity value of doing this, the benefit, not just the monetary, in other words, can actually be truly evaluated. It needs to be, I would say, smaller than a borough by a long way. A few wards would be good. But that's a bit of a guess.
Yeah, I suspect they might be trying some different approaches in different areas. So that's, yeah.
And yeah, so I fully can I just add to that? Yeah, a decent-sized pilot. And really, I think what you're doing is you're developing and testing a process as opposed to the individual project. And I think that's the important thing to note, to show how engagement works and you know, the M&E, the benefit on those people's lives before and after. So it's a big piece of work, even for us, you know, a small discrete project. But what we're trying to pull from that, I think, is to show that the process of engagement works and the tangible benefits of doing so. So that would be the focus I would recommend.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember McCartney and Assemblymember Mahfouz.
Thank you both for your contributions. Just following on really from Assemblymember McCartney's questions, and you talked about the lived experience being integrated in terms of co-design and co-cultivation going forward. So wanted to talk about what importance you felt there was in relation to equality impact assessments as part of this process, and how you feel that they can be carried out in the most effective way.
And Bassam, I think this is one more for Nick than for me, because it's a little bit outside my area of expertise.
I'm sure it isn't. Well, the first thing you have to decide is what do you mean by quality? And that's where your co-cultivation exercise comes in, because understanding what people see as quality is, I think, really important, and they will have different views about that. And we need to kind of get off the idea that quality is some idea of a luxury. We shouldn't be thinking.
Sorry, this is just to be clear, equality impact assessment.
Equality,
so, equality. So it is about assessments that public sector organisations like ours will carry out in relation to any project to ensure that people with protected characteristics are not impacted negatively.
Yep. Okay, yeah, understood. So I misheard. So, but the same answer applies. You still have to go and talk to the issue around. I mean, we've kind of brushed on some of that about who gains and who loses from various interventions, and I think it is really important to get away from that. The sense that we need to look at the money side. I mean, obviously, everything does cost, but I think ultimately it's the feeling that people have of being felt to be equal and feeling that they are equal that we're trying to get at. And that kind of needs much more of a sort of nuanced understanding about what actually is meant by both equality itself and the impact of not having equality. And so how does that mean for somebody walking down a high street, or somebody being able to get into a station or not, and those sorts of things? What does it mean? There's a bit of a temptation to try and count too much, I think. And we really need to understand the depth of the meaning of somebody not being able to access, for example, a train. It isn't just that they can't do it. It means things. It means they do not have access to their life. And what we're really talking about here isn't transport. It's about living. And that sense of curtailing somebody's ability to live their life because of some particular characteristic that they have, which may be anything, that is something which we want to try and avoid. And I think how we assess that has to be based on how people feel about that. And maybe we need to work out how we record that, how we work with it, because it won't be in numbers. It'll be in expressions. It'll be. We've often found that people drawing things. We've done whole surveys where people draw. Just give them a piece of paper and they draw, and you realise how tense they find some streets and how relaxing they find other streets simply by the way of drawing. So it doesn't have to be words even. But I think we need to, but then you get that understanding of how they feel, and then from that you can start to think about what is the impact of whatever it is that we're doing on that feeling. It makes it feel, or it makes it seem a relatively squidgy thing. And in a sense, we don't like squidgy things. We would love everything to be very clear. But actually, equality is kind of perceived by the beholder. And we need to understand how the beholder sees that question so that we can understand how we can start to assess it.
Thank you, Nick. So in terms of using those equality impact assessments to really measure the impact on quality of life effectively by whatever project gets taken forward, you talk very much about the qualitative feedback from individuals, and we started the whole conversation around actually everybody is different. But you're also obviously work at UCL, and it's about measuring, and organisations like TfL are very much about making sure that they've got the quantitative data that can translate that. Is there anything from an academic point of view that you've seen that helps translate some of that qualitative, really important content into something that's quantitative that can be used to support the equality impact assessments?
Yes. It's kind of what we're doing, in a sense. And I think the reason I'm kind of hesitating about that is it is at very early stages. But part of what I do is to look at how people respond to a particular situation. And so take a bus stop with a cycle lane attached to it, for example. We've just been doing this stuff with guide dogs. How do they feel about that? We can ask them. That would be the normal thing to do. But what we also do is we do take measures of the kinds of responses that the brain in particular, but also the physiology of the body has. So we can measure stress levels. We can measure how that changes when you bring a certain situation to light. So what happens if you turn all the lights out, for example? Or what happens if a person is going into a space which is very poorly lit compared with a space which is well lit? Those sorts of things. So we can ask them about all of that, and we will get an answer. We can also measure things. And so what we're learning to do is how we can actually bring those measures and those answers together. And one of the interesting things is it depends a bit, because sometimes they conflict. And we have to kind of understand the agenda of the person answering the question. So if they feel, for example, and we've had this with older people, for example, who will tell us that they feel absolutely fine, and it was all very easy climbing up 57 steps. And they will insist on that. But I look at their physiology and I think you're nearly dead, you know. And that's because what we have to understand is that's not because they're telling us a lie. It's because they have to prove to themselves that they found it easy in order to live. And so I think we can blend. There are ways of doing that. You can't go out onto Brixton High Street and do a lot of those kinds of measurements. You have to do them in controlled environments, which we have, so we can do that. But I think there are ways where you can determine that we can find things like stress, for example, and fear. We saw that very much with the bus stops, the sense of fear. And that is important in establishing these kinds of questions, I think. So I think there are ways. I would say it's kind of nascent at the moment.
And Bassam, may I just add to that? So, and it's super interesting discussion. I think to answer your question, the mood of what we're talking about today is about engagement and listening to people. And I often do the speech about the importance of transport in that it gives you access to education, employment, healthcare, and a social life. One of those students I talked about says, you've got those in the wrong order, Paul. And she says, social life is the first thing that's more important. Okay, so what are the metrics we use and who decides what those metrics are? And I would suggest we ask people what's important to them. And by asking them what's important to them, we then report on that, and that becomes our metric. And rather than imposing our own kind of value judgment on that. And also we're doing some research again on kind of cost-benefit stuff. How does one evaluate what effect a project has? And part of that will be looking at quality of life of individuals. Often a bridge gets built that's not accessible because, well, there's only 2% of people here who will benefit because they're wheelchair users, but actually that's critical to their quality of life, and that doesn't get recorded. So somehow we need to, in our recordings, better understand what's a criticality versus a nice to have, and to make sure those people aren't excluded.
Thanks, both. Certainly going back to your point there about the conflicting fears and anxieties, actually, because I think we talked quite a bit today about floating bus stops, and actually, as a cyclist myself, I prefer not to use those because actually there's an anxiety for me that I'm going to be potentially hitting somebody, and I'd rather put myself at risk in the road rather than rather than putting a pedestrian at risk of me, going into them, because clearly I'll slow down at any case, but actually it's the balances that we were talking about earlier. Just in relation to actually making sure that equality impact assessments can have the impact that they're intended to. Recent report said that that they tend to be completed at the end of the design process. For it to have the most impact, how do you feel that it can be used as part of that process that we've talked about, co-cultivation, co-design?
For me, I think the end is the wrong time. I think you start doing your quality impact assessment when you're doing your preparation of the ground to plant your seeds in. That's where you start, and you build it through all of that. Because if you take your farmer, if he doesn't do the ground preparation properly, he's going to have rubbish plants, and that's what's going to happen. So I think you have to start right at the beginning. And it's a continuing process. It's not something that you just sort of write your report, as Paul was saying earlier, you write your report at the end of the project and it's done. It's actually the beginning of the next phase. It has to be ongoing. We have to kind of create the culture whereby we are always thinking about the quality of and the equality going on in the world. And I think it just needs to become what we do, and that means it's continual. So I would say you have to do it starting out right at the beginning, before you start doing anything.
And if I could add in broader sort of M&E monitoring and evaluation, we want ideally to understand, what's the state of life before an intervention, and then there's an intervention, and then we can clearly see, the effects. But also in wider kind of product design, in mainstream design, who are successful businesses? They know their customers. They're always engaging. It's not engaging for the period of a project, is it? It's continuing engagement. And yes, there may be a project or a vehicle or a transport mode that gets designed, and they're part of that process, as we've heard. But then, okay, how successful is that? We monitor it, and it's ongoing, and then we make change. So it's a continual engagement process.
Oh, thank you both. And I think what's clear there is about effectively sort of testing that product, isn't it, Paul? So you'd see what happens. And I think one of the challenges is sometimes you try and deal with one risk by creating an unintended consequence and a risk elsewhere. So actually making sure that those then get built into designs going forward. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. A really interesting conversation, particularly on those last points that you were just making about the ongoing need for assessment and also that continued engagement. So as we have to make recommendations at the end of this report, one of the things that I picked up on was the fact that TfL currently has a inclusive transport forum that meets 4 times a year and an independent disability advisory group with 10 members, which also advises with expertise and knowledge. Again, this is on a case-by-case situation. So at the moment, they've worked apparently 90 projects. Now, that doesn't sound to me to be a continuing, ongoing process. That sounds to me like a stop and then start and stop and start and stop and start. Is there any examples that TfL could get, and you were mentioning international examples, are there any examples internationally that they could take on that would improve that model?
Can I, well, I could start asking you some questions and ask if you would be comfortable if we invested your pension or whatever on the basis of talking to 10 people. You know, that sounds a dangerous kind of way of doing things, doesn't it? And it's fantastic that there's been engagement, and it's wonderful that those are set up. I think when we have a small group of people, that they often become kind of professional participants, and they lose a little bit of that quality that perhaps engaging with somebody in the street gets. So I would certainly advocate a larger engagement group with a lot of frequent touch points. And you know, when we engage with people in our databases, we try hard to reach out to fresh people on different occasions. We don't want kind of professional questionnaire fillers in who are always telling us a certain thing and become experts themselves. So we want really to reach out to a wider group of people. And you know, when we've talked about, it's wonderful, isn't it, coming to London and looking at the diversity of people. So again, our challenge, can 10 people represent all those users of that system? So if there were a recommendation I'd suggest you make, it's to add to the excellence that's happening to increase the number of people that are engaged with.
I want to come in at this point. So.
Yeah, it was just that Nick earlier said that you thought that we should get people and actually give them the technical ability to actually engage properly. And how do you reconcile those two different views then, if you want? Yeah, sorry.
I think the two are a challenge. I think I totally agree with Paul. I think you need more, and you need it more often, and it needs to feel continuous. And I think you don't need to meet, and it's very tempting for an organisation like TfL to say, oh, we've got our group of people, so we can meet with them and we get to know them. And that's fine, and there are values in that. But actually, I think they should be doing it on a much, much more continuing basis with people that they haven't met before. So maybe on almost, I mean, I don't know how you actually do this, but actually almost like pick out a section out of the population and say, you know, next month, you 30 people we're going to talk to you about this, and we will come to you, and not you come. Yes, and so I think there's things around that would be worth just to get a much wider view for all the reasons that Paul is saying. I think that's absolutely right. I think we have to radically change the education of people like engineers and planners, and so that they understand this kind of stuff much more. There's a book you might like to give TfL, if you feel generous, it's just published. Actually, I think it was published about a month ago, but it's only just appeared in the UK. It's called "Killed by a Traffic Engineer." And it's very much written on the USA. It's very much written on the USA model, where the traffic engineers kind of have a sort of image. But it does apply to the UK. And one of the things they point out is that the number one cause of death in the UK is traffic accidents. in the USA. And they are trained to do things in such a way that you will continue to do that. And every time somebody challenges them on that, they say, well, it's the driver's fault, or it's the police didn't enforce it, or it's always somebody else. And so this book is all about that. I think I would recommend doing that. But you could almost want, killed by the accessibility person or something. You want to sort of sense that a complete rethink behind why are we creating a world in which probably every part of the population at some point or other, some of them more frequently than others, cannot actually use it. Why are we designing like that? I mean, it's a really good question. And we are so kind of pumping people out there, continuing in the same way. I think there is a real message, and maybe because of its role, leadership role, I think TfL is in a very good position to start laying down the rules on that. They employ, or they encourage to be employed, or the local authorities employ and have to deal with TfL. So TfL is in a very strong position to say, no, we want the traffic engineers to be able to do this. We would like that kind of consultation. We want that kind of participation. I think they could be much stronger about that, and then use that to influence how the local authorities, the boroughs, then pull together in order to be able to respond to that.
Thank you, Nick. I mean, I do want to just clarify a point that from the previous panel, there was just a discussion about consultation fatigue. So we do need to be wary of the fact that that is a concern. But also on that point of the continued and ongoing need for that engagement, would there not be an argument perhaps that there's necessary need for a permanent position of somebody within TfL or, to be able to do that continuous assessment and have that role to make sure that engagement continues on, a permanent role that does that accessibility engagement that we so need within transport?
Well, could I say that I think there needs to be a process change. So there needs to be a process in place, and perhaps that person you describe is the process owner. And on any discrete project that gets signed off, there needs to be engagement. And engagement with more than 10 people who have engagement fatigue. And in particular, it's an academic thing on how you select people who take part and whatever else. But, if we're saying there's 20% of people crudely in London, well, you've got a lot of people you can contact and draw down to help you. And, don't just get people who use the tube to tell you what the tube's like. Get people who don't use public transport because they're frightened of using it or they've had a bad experience in the past. So you need to be reaching out to potential users as well as regular users to really understand people's needs. So if there's a recommendation, yes, perhaps a figurehead with a lived experience of disability and technical skills, but that person needs to be overseeing the process because every project needs to
That's great. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm very happy to help.
I think consultation fatigue is an interesting one because that kind of happens because you're asking the same people a lot and nothing happens. And so I think that the answer to consultation fatigue is actually to rethink, kind of what Paul is suggesting also, I think, that is to rethink what you mean. And come back to the traffic people out on the streets in their red jackets. They are consulting 4 days a week with the population of the city, permanently. There's no sign of consultation fatigue. And it's because it's not consultation, it's conversation, it's engagement, it's a mutual interaction, it's all of those things that then feed directly back into the people who are going to be making the actual planning and engineering decisions in the city. So I think it is a change of process away from the idea that we have a project, we're going to consult you about that project because we're very nice people and we like you because you're not going to be too dangerous to us, so it's all fine. And by the way, can you do it again next week and can you do it the week after? And we're not actually going to do anything about this. I think we move on from that into, let's have some serious conversations and listening about what are the needs going on, and making it into a much more continuing process, but where there are things that happen. And in a sense, the advantage that they have in Colombia there is that some of those things will be very small and very easy to do very quickly. I saw one case where they just turned benches around so they faced the other way, and suddenly people used the benches. Why would you want to go and look at the traffic when you could look at a park, kind of thing, you know? And those sorts of things, that was almost, there's a guy with a spanner. You know, it's very, very easy to resolve. So those little things help to create the sense that the engagement is producing because things are happening. And I think it's the sort of kind of psychology of dealing with your community not as somebody the other side of a glass wall, but actually we're all part of this. And we're all in this together. We all want it to work. And how do we actually do it? And it's a continuing process. So your person, I would agree with Paul, I think it's a process owner who is going to be very busy because they're actually, they themselves or their team or not their team, but they need to be in the position where the transport engineers, the planners will engage in that process. So they need to be in a position where that can happen without it being a sort of a special little team that sits in a rather nasty office on the corner somewhere that nobody really wants to go and see. It needs to be embedded in the organisation more. And yes, there probably needs to be somebody who can voice that.
We are out of time. Are you able to make your final comment quite
Can I just
brief?
make a quick one?
I hate cutting guests off.
If you heard it from Emma, just stop me in the first session. But in order for that engagement to work, and I think there was a question earlier, those people that one is engaging with need to be paid fairly. And, you know, when there are consultants on £1,000 a day and then somebody's been given their travelling expenses to come and sit for a day to be that token person who's being engaged with, well, they are going to get fatigue, aren't they? So I think we've established today they're vital members of any project, and the project will only be successful through strong engagement, and then we need to value that engagement in very real terms. So we're, from a psychological perspective, we're showing people what effects their input has had on projects, and they all feel super motivated, but we shouldn't be doing that for minimum wage when there's other people in the room getting paid huge rates. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for making that point. And we're out of time. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us as well. It's been absolutely fascinating. We did have one more question, which was specifically about TfL's planned Inclusive Design Centre of Excellence. If you have any, we'll put that in writing to you. So if you do have any views on that, would be really. And if anything, if there's anything you didn't manage to say today that you would, then please do let us know. But thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all our guests for attending this morning and this afternoon and for their answers to our questions. The committee just has a couple more items of business to deal with, only take a couple of minutes, but you're free to leave the chamber if you'd like to while we do that. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Agreed. Can we note the work programme and meeting dates?
Noted.
And the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 26th of September 2024 at 10 o'clock in the Chamber in City Hall. And there is no urgent business. Thank you. The meeting is now closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.